Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The oil derricks stretched across the Permian Basin like skeletal fingers clawing at the star-filled Texas sky. It was 11:47 p.m. when my radio crackled to life, cutting through the oppressive silence of my patrol route along State Highway 349. I'd been working the graveyard shift for Midland County Police Department for 8 years, but something about this particular October night made my skin crawl. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the distant flares from natural gas burns cast dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Unit 47, we have a 1054 at Blackstone Energy Site, mile marker 23. Possible fatality. EMS en route. I grabbed the radio, my coffee growing cold in the cup holder. The bitter taste of cheap station coffee turned to ash in my mouth as I responded. Unit 47 responding. ETA 15 minutes. Something in the dispatcher's voice had been off. A tremor that spoke of scenes that would haunt a person's dreams. The drive through the oil patch was always unsettling at night, but tonight felt different. Pump jacks nodded rhythmically in the darkness, like prehistoric vultures feeding on rotting earth, while gas flares illuminated the landscape in hellish orange that made every shadow writhe with unnatural life. The smell of crude oil and sulfur hung heavy in the air, mixing with something else, something sweet and sickly that reminded me of meat left too long in the Texas heat. Blackstone Energy loomed ahead like a fortress of steel and shadow. Their safety record had been clean. Too clean, I realized now. In the oil patch, accidents happened with terrifying regularity. Men died in explosions, fell from derricks, were crushed by machinery. But Blackstone, not a single reportable incident in 2 years. That kind of luck didn't exist in this business. As I approached the site, emergency vehicles painted the industrial landscape in pulsing red and blue that made the derricks look like torture devices. 2 ambulances sat with their rear doors gaping open like hungry mouths, and Fire Chief Robert Morrison stood near the gate, his weathered face pale as bone under the harsh sodium lights. The site foreman, James Patterson, waited by the entrance. I'd known James for 5 years. He was a straight shooter who'd seen everything the oil patch could throw at a man. But tonight his hands shook like autumn leaves, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd witnessed something that defied explanation. "What do we have, James?" I asked, stepping into air that tasted of metal and fear. "It's Michael Torres," James whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical breathing of the pumps. "One of our best men found him about 30 minutes ago." He paused, swallowing hard. "Officer Williams, in 30 years of working these fields, I ain't never seen anything like this. It's wrong. All wrong." The way he said wrong made ice form in my veins. James had pulled men from burning derricks, had seen workers crushed to paste by machinery, had held dying men in his arms. What could shake him so badly? "Where's the body?" "Near the mud tanks, but—" "Officer," James grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in like claws. "Before you see it, you need to know something." Michael was scared. Real scared. Past few weeks he kept looking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows. Said he was being watched. We walked toward the cluster of steel tanks, our footsteps echoing off metal surfaces with a hollow funeral sound. The industrial lighting created pools of harsh white, broken by gulfs of impenetrable shadow. perfect places for predators to hide. I found myself checking those dark spaces, my hand drifting unconsciously to my service weapon. Other workers stood in small groups, but something was wrong with them too. They moved like sleepwalkers, their conversations barely whispers. When they looked at me, their eyes darted away immediately, as if making eye contact might curse them with whatever fate had claimed Michael Torres. How long had Michael been out here tonight? I asked, pulling out my notebook with fingers that weren't quite steady. Started at 6 p.m. We found him when he didn't answer his radio at 11:15. James stopped beside a cylindrical tank that rose 20 feet into the night like a metal monument. This is where I saw the yellow tarp first, fluttering in a breeze that carried the stench of industrial chemicals and something else, something organic and foul. EMT Sarah Mitchell approached with her clipboard, but her usual professional confidence had cracked. Her face was ashen, and her hands trembled as she spoke. Officer Williams. Victim is Michael Torres, age 34. Apparent fall from height, but... She glanced at the tarp, then quickly away. There are some irregularities, some things that don't make sense. When I lifted the tarp, the breath left my lungs in a rush. Michael Torres lay at the base of the tank, but he looked arranged, positioned. His arms were crossed over his chest like a corpse prepared for burial, and his eyes stared sightlessly at the star-filled sky. The head wound was severe, too severe for a simple fall, and the blood around it had congealed in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. But it was his face that made my stomach lurch. His mouth was open in a scream that would never end, and his features were twisted in absolute terror. The expression of a man who had seen his death coming and knew it would be neither quick nor merciful. "Sarah," I managed, my voice hoarse, "fall victims don't look like this. That's what's been eating at me. The positioning, the blood patterns. It's like someone took time with him, like they wanted to send a message." She pointed to his work clothes. "And look at this." Someone had carved a symbol into Michael's hard hat, a crude circle with lines radiating outward like a diseased sun. The cuts were deep, deliberate, made with a blade that had been twisted for maximum damage. I studied the tank more carefully. A steel ladder led to a platform where gauges monitored fluid levels. It was routine work, something Michael had done hundreds of times. But tonight, routine had become nightmare. James, was Michael having problems with anyone? Threats? Disputes? James's face went even paler. That's just it. Michael was well liked, good family man, 2 kids in Odessa. But these past weeks... He lowered his voice to barely a whisper. He came to me 3 days ago, said someone had been in his house. Nothing stolen, but things moved around. Personal photos torn up. His daughter's bedroom window left open. The implications hit me like ice water. Someone had been terrorizing Michael Torres, escalating from psychological warfare to home invasion to this. I examined the area around the tank, my flashlight beam cutting through shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. The gravel showed signs of a struggle, drag marks, scuff patterns, dark stains that weren't oil. And there, about 10 feet from the body, I found something that made my blood run cold. A safety harness hung from a piece of twisted rebar, but it hadn't failed from wear or age. Someone had cut it. Not just cut it, but severed it in multiple places, as if they'd wanted to ensure there would be no chance of survival. The cuts were surgical, precise, professional. James, who else is on site tonight? Just the skeleton crew. 5 men plus our safety supervisor, Charles Bennett. James glanced around nervously. But, officer, there's something else you need to know. Michael wasn't the first. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? 6 months ago, we had another man, Robert Martinez, quit suddenly. Said he was being followed, that someone had threatened his family. Found out later he died in a car accident in New Mexico. Then there was David Chen, transferred to Alaska after reporting some irregularities. Word came back he had an accident up there too. Fell through ice. The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. Someone was systematically eliminating Blackstone employees, but making it look like accidents, coincidences, random misfortune. Michael Torres had been the latest, but unlike the others, his killer had gotten sloppy. Or maybe they'd wanted to send a message. As I documented the scene, photographing evidence that would give me nightmares for years to come, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The industrial facility created dozens of hiding places, shadows behind equipment where predators could observe their prey. Every time I thought I caught movement, it vanished like smoke. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. As I worked, taking measurements and collecting samples, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The other workers weren't just scared, they were terrified. And their fear wasn't directed at some unknown killer. They were afraid of each other, the way they stood in separate groups, never turning their backs on one another, checking and rechecking the shadows. These men knew the killer was among them. They knew that someone they worked with, ate lunch with, shared jokes with, was capable of the ritualistic butchery I just witnessed. In the distance, coyotes began to howl, a mournful sound that seemed to mourn the death of safety, of trust, of the illusion that evil couldn't penetrate even the most remote corners of Texas. But I was about to learn that evil hadn't penetrated this place. It had been born here. By 3 a.m., I had interviewed 5 of the 6 crew members, and their testimonies painted a picture more disturbing than any horror movie. Each man told me about the gradual change in atmosphere at the site, how conversations had died to whispers, how men had started working in pairs, how tools had begun disappearing only to reappear in places they shouldn't be. But it was what they didn't say that terrified me most. The way their eyes darted to the shadows when they spoke, the way they flinched at sudden sounds, the way they kept checking the locks on the trailer door, as if something might try to get in. The crew foreman's office felt like a tomb. Coffee-stained papers covered the desk, but I noticed something unsettling. Michael Torres's timesheet from the past month showed increasingly erratic hours. He'd been working late, staying behind after his shift, as if he'd been investigating something, or running from it. "Let's go over this again, Thomas," I said to the last crew member, Thomas Richardson. He was a thin man whose hands shook as he lit one cigarette after another, his nicotine-stained fingers trembling with barely controlled terror. "I already told you everything," Thomas whispered, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man keeping deadly secrets. Michael was trying to warn us about something." "Warn you about what?" Thomas glanced around the trailer as if the walls themselves might be listening. "You ever notice how quiet it gets out here at night? I mean really quiet? It ain't natural. Something's wrong with this place, officer, something evil." "Thomas, I need facts, not..." "Facts?" He laughed, a broken sound. "The fact is, men have been dying around here for months, and every time we try to report it, something happens to shut us up. The fact is, Michael found something he shouldn't have found, and now he's dead. The fact is, we're all marked men." I studied the shift logs James had provided. According to the records, Thomas had signed out for a break at 9:45 p.m. and hadn't returned until 11:30 p.m., 15 minutes after Michael's body was discovered. An hour and 45 minutes unaccounted for. "Where were you during that time, Thomas?" His cigarette trembled between his lips. I was hiding. Hiding from what? From whoever's been picking us off, one by one. Thomas stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another. You think Michael was the first? Hell no. This place is cursed, officer, cursed or worse. Before I could press further, the trailer door opened with a rusty screech that made us both jump. Charles Bennett entered, and immediately the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was a clean-cut man in pressed khakis, but something about him made my instincts scream danger. Terrible tragedy, Bennett said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as cold. Michael was one of our most observant workers. The way he emphasized observant made my spine crawl. This wasn't grief, this was satisfaction. The satisfaction of a predator who'd successfully eliminated prey. When did you last see Michael Torres? Yesterday afternoon, we had a discussion about some concerns he'd raised. Bennett's smile never reached his eyes. Michael had developed some paranoid delusions recently. Thought he was being watched, followed. Very sad, really. What kind of concerns? Bennett paused, and in that moment of silence I could hear something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Heavy boots walking slowly around the outside of the trailer, circling us like a predator circles wounded prey. Just workplace stress. The isolation gets to some men. Makes them imagine things. Bennett glanced toward the window, where shadows moved in the industrial lighting. Michael thought he saw patterns where none existed. Thought people were out to get him. The footsteps stopped directly outside the window. Through the thin aluminum walls I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, patient. Someone was listening to every word we said. I'll need copies of all safety reports, maintenance records, personnel files, I managed, my hand moving instinctively toward my weapon. Of course, Bennett replied, but his eyes were fixed on the window where a shadow had fallen across the glass. We run a very thorough operation here. After Bennett left, I sat alone with Thomas, in the suffocating trailer. The footsteps had moved on, but their echo seemed to linger in the air like a threat. You need to get out of here, Thomas whispered. Tonight, don't come back. Thomas, if you know something, I know enough to keep my mouth shut and my head down. He crushed out his cigarette with violent force. Michael didn't. Look what happened to him. My radio crackled, making us both jump like startled animals. Unit 47, return to station. Detective Morrison wants to see you. As I drove back through the pre-dawn darkness, the oil derricks looked different. Not like industrial equipment, but like gallows. Each one a place where someone had died, where blood had been spilled, where screams had been swallowed by the endless Texas sky. At the station, Detective Morrison waited with a man who radiated corporate menace. Daniel Crawford from Blackstone Energy's Houston office wore an expensive suit, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a professional killer. Officer Williams, Crawford said, extending a hand that felt like ice, I want to assure you that Blackstone Energy will cooperate fully with your investigation. We're very interested in containing this situation. The way he said containing made my stomach lurch. This wasn't about cooperation, this was about control, about making sure certain truths never saw daylight. Mr. Crawford, I'll need access to all company records related to Michael Torres. Absolutely. Though I should mention Michael had been showing signs of severe psychological distress recently. We were actually considering mandatory counseling. Crawford's smile was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. Sometimes the isolation of oil field work can drive men to desperate acts. Are you suggesting suicide? I'm suggesting that traumatized men sometimes do things that appear suspicious to outsiders. Sometimes they even arrange their own accidents to look like murder. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. They were going to paint Michael Torres as a mentally ill suicide case, and anyone who contradicted that narrative would face the same fate. After Crawford left, Detective Morrison and I sat in silence that stretched like a taut wire. "David, you need to understand something," she finally said. "Blackstone Energy isn't just a company, it's a machine that eats people who get in its way. Detective, a man was murdered, and if you're not careful, you'll be next." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "3 investigators have looked into Blackstone operations over the past 2 years. 1 died in a car accident. 1 committed suicide. 1 just disappeared." The room felt like it was closing in around me. If Detective Morrison, a woman who'd faced down armed drug dealers and serial killers and was scared, then I was walking into something far worse than a simple murder case. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you to be very, very careful." "And David?" She looked directly into my eyes. "Don't trust anyone, not even me." As I left the station, dawn was breaking over the Texas plains, but instead of bringing light and hope, it only revealed the true scope of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. Somewhere out there, a killer was watching, waiting, planning the next move in a game where the stakes were measured in lives, and I was about to become the next player. The autopsy results arrived at noon, and they shattered any hope that Michael Torres had died accidentally. County Coroner Dr. Susan Martinez called me into her office with a voice tight with professional horror. "David, in 20 years of this job, I've never seen anything like this," she said, spreading photographs across her desk like tarot cards predicting doom. "Michael Torres was tortured before he died." The images made my vision blur. Michael's body showed signs of systematic brutalization. Burns from cigarettes in precise patterns, cuts that had been made slowly and deliberately, ligature marks that suggested he'd been restrained for hours. The head trauma was the final blow, but it came after extensive interrogation. Someone wanted information from him, and they were willing to do anything to get it. Dr. Martinez closed the file with hands that shook. "David, whoever did this enjoyed it. The torture marks show evidence of someone who took their time, who savored each moment of pain they inflicted. How long was he alive during the torture? Based on blood coagulation and tissue response, at least 3 hours, maybe 4. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He was conscious for most of it. I drove back to the Blackstone site in broad daylight, but somehow it looked even more menacing under the harsh Texas sun. The metal structures seemed to radiate malevolence, and the workers moved like ghosts haunting their own grave. James Patterson was waiting for me in the office trailer, but he was no longer the man I'd spoken to the night before. His face was gray as concrete, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who'd seen hell and knew he was going there soon. "They came to see me this morning," he whispered before I could even sit down. "2 men in suits. Said they wanted to discuss my future with the company." "What did they want?" "They wanted to know what Michael had told me, what he'd found, what I might have seen." James lit a cigarette with hands that shook like earthquake victims. "They weren't asking, officer. They were informing me that my cooperation was mandatory." He showed me a photograph that had been left on his kitchen table, his 8-year-old granddaughter walking to school, unaware that a telephoto lens was tracking her every step. "They know where my family lives. They know my granddaughter's routine. They made it very clear what would happen if I didn't keep my mouth shut." "James, what did Michael discover?" For a long moment he stared at the photograph of his granddaughter, calculating whether her life was worth the truth. Finally, he pulled out a manila envelope hidden beneath maintenance reports. Michael found these, hidden in the record archives, filed under fake case numbers. He handed me documents that made my blood turn to ice water. They're not just stealing oil, officer. They're disposing of bodies. The papers detailed a systematic operation spanning years. Workers who asked too many questions were eliminated, their deaths staged as accidents. But some bodies couldn't be explained away, so they were dissolved in industrial acids, and their remains mixed into concrete used for equipment foundations. How many people? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Michael estimated at least 20 over the past 5 years, maybe more. James stubbed out his cigarette with violent force. They've been feeding people to this place, officer, literally feeding them to the machines. The implications crashed over me like a toxic wave. Every piece of equipment, every concrete foundation, every structure on this site was potentially a grave marker for someone who'd discovered the truth and paid for it with their life. Where are Michael's original documents? Hidden in his locker. But officer, there's something else. James glanced around the trailer as if the walls might have ears. Michael wasn't working alone. He had a partner, someone helping him document the murders. Who? William Foster. Day shift maintenance. But Foster disappeared 2 days after Michael's murder. Officially transferred to Alaska, but... James shook his head. I don't think Foster made it to Alaska. We walked to the workers' locker area, a prefabricated building that felt like a mausoleum. Michael's locker was secured with a simple padlock, but when I cut it open, we found something that made my knees buckle. The locker had been cleaned out, but whoever had done it had missed something hidden behind a loose panel. A small digital camera, the kind workers use to document safety violations. When I turned it on, the screen filled with images that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Michael Torres had documented everything. Photographs of body parts being loaded into industrial grinders. Images of concrete being poured over human remains. Pictures of Charles Bennett directing the disposal operations with the calm efficiency of a mortician. But the final images on the camera were the most horrifying. They showed Michael himself, bound and helpless in some underground chamber beneath the facility. His face was twisted in agony as unseen torturers worked on him just outside the frame. And in the background, barely visible, was a wall covered with photographs of other victims. Dozens of faces staring out with the empty eyes of the dead. Jesus Christ, James whispered, staring at the camera's screen. How many people did they kill? Before I could answer, we heard footsteps outside the building. Heavy boots, moving with purpose. Multiple sets surrounding the building like wolves closing in on trapped prey. They know we found it, James said, his voice hollow with despair. They know, and now we're both dead. The footsteps stopped outside the door. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears like war drums. Then came a sound that turned my spine to ice, the slow, deliberate scraping of metal on metal as someone tried the door handle. The door was locked, but locks wouldn't stop what was coming for us. I drew my service weapon, knowing it was probably useless against whatever nightmare had been unleashed in this place. The camera in my hand contained evidence of serial murder on an industrial scale, but first, I had to survive long enough to get it to safety. Outside, the footsteps began to circle the building again, patient and methodical, hunting us, stalking us, preparing for the kill. The true horror of Blackstone Energy wasn't just that they killed people, it was how they did. It was the cold efficiency of a factory assembly line. Murder as business practice. death as corporate policy, and I was about to become their next case study in efficient elimination. The footsteps outside the locker building had stopped, replaced by something far more terrifying: absolute silence. James and I crouched behind a row of metal lockers, our breathing the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone dead quiet. Then came the smell. It started as a faint chemical odor seeping under the door, but quickly intensified into something that burned our nostrils and made our eyes water. Industrial solvent. The same chemicals they use to dissolve bodies. "They're going to gas us," James whispered, his voice tight with panic. "Pump chemicals in here and dissolve us alive." I looked around desperately for another exit, but the building had been designed like a trap. One door, no windows, concrete walls that would contain screams along with chemical fumes. We were rats in a maze, and the experimenters were about to release the poison. The camera in my hand felt like a burning coal. Evidence of dozens of murders, but only valuable if I could get it out of this death trap. "Is there a ventilation system?" I asked, trying to keep panic out of my voice. James pointed to a grate near the ceiling. "Leads to the main air system, but it's too small for a man to—" The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in hellish red that made the rising chemical fog look like blood vapor. Through the crimson haze, I saw shadows moving outside, shapes that seemed too tall and thin to be human, moving with the predatory grace of things that hunted in darkness. My radio crackled with static, and through the white noise came a voice that turned my blood to ice water. "Officer Williams, we know you're in there. We know what you found. Come out now, and we'll make it quick." The voice was Charles Bennett's, but distorted by something that might have been electronic equipment or might have been in human vocal cords. Behind his words, I could hear other sounds: machinery starting up, heavy equipment being moved into position. "You can't hide forever," Bennett continued. "We've had years to perfect our methods. We know every hiding place, every escape route. We know how to make people disappear without a trace." The chemical fog was getting thicker, making us cough and gag. Whatever they were pumping in was designed to incapacitate before it killed. They wanted us conscious for what came next. I made a decision that would either save our lives or ensure we died horribly. Grabbing a crowbar from a maintenance cart, I attacked the ventilation grate with desperate strength. Metal shrieked against metal as I pried it open, revealing a duct that led into the facility's bowels. "We have to go through the air system," I told James. "It's the only way out." "I can't fit through there. You have to. It's that or die here." James was right. He was too big for the duct. But as the chemicals thickened around us, making our vision blur and our lungs burn, he made the same choice I had. Better to die trying than to surrender to whatever Bennett had planned. I went first, pulling myself through sheet metal that scraped skin and tore clothing. Behind me, James struggled and gasped, his larger frame barely fitting through the narrow passage. The sound of his labored breathing echoed through the ductwork like the death rattle of a trapped animal. The air system led through the facility's underground levels, areas that hadn't appeared on any blueprint I'd seen. As we crawled through the nightmare maze of ducts, I began to understand the true scope of what Michael Torres had discovered. Through ventilation grills, I saw rooms that belonged in the deepest circles of hell. Operating theaters where human bodies were systematically dismantled. Industrial chambers where flesh was dissolved in acid baths. Storage areas where bones were ground to powder and mixed with concrete. And in the center of it all, like the altar of a death cult, was a room filled with photographs. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every person who had ever asked questions about Blackstone Energy operations. Every victim who had been fed to the machine. Michael Torres's face stared out from the wall of the dead, but he wasn't alone. I saw men and women from every walk of life. Oil workers, safety inspectors, journalists, investigators, even children whose only crime had been having parents who asked inconvenient questions. We were crawling through the digestive system of a monster that had been feeding on human lives for decades, growing stronger with each murder, more efficient with each disposal, more sophisticated in its methods of eliminating threats. Behind me, James had stopped moving. When I turned around, I saw why. A section of ductwork had collapsed, pinning his legs beneath twisted metal. Blood pooled around the sharp edges, and his face was pale with shock and pain. "Go," he whispered. "Get that camera out of here. Tell the world what they're doing." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to. It's the only way to stop them." He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "My granddaughter. Make sure she's safe." The sound of machinery was getting closer. Industrial grinders starting up, acid pumps beginning their deadly cycle. They were preparing to dispose of whatever was left of us after the chemicals did their work. I made the hardest choice of my life. I left James trapped in the ductwork and continued crawling toward what I hoped was an exit. His whispered prayers followed me through the metal maze as I navigated toward either salvation or a more horrible death. The duct finally opened into a maintenance room filled with pumps and pipes. I dropped to the floor, gasping clean air and trying to orient myself. The camera was still clutched in my hand, its digital memory holding evidence of industrial-scale murder. But as I reached for the door handle, it turned from the other side. Charles Bennett stepped into the room, no longer bothering with his corporate facade. His clothes were splattered with something dark and wet, and his hands held tools that were designed for dismantling more than machinery. "Hello, Officer Williams," he said, his voice carrying the calm satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. "We've been waiting for you." Behind him came others, workers I'd interviewed, men who had seemed frightened and innocent. But now I saw them for what they really were, components in a killing machine, each one specialized in some aspect of murder and disposal. "You found Michael's camera," Bennett observed, gesturing toward the device in my hand. "Very thorough, our Michael. Very detailed in his documentation. Unfortunately, very dead as a result." He stepped closer, and I could smell chemicals on his clothes, the same industrial solvents they used to dissolve bodies. "Did you enjoy the tour? See our underground facilities? We're quite proud of our efficiency record. 0 evidence, 0 witnesses, 0 problems. People will look for me." Bennett's laugh was the sound of madness given voice. "People have been looking for others. They never find anything. Because there's nothing to find. We've perfected the art of making human beings simply disappear." He held up one of his tools, something that looked like a surgical instrument crossed with a meat hook. Michael screamed for hours before we let him die. He told us everything about his investigation, everyone he'd talked to, every piece of evidence he'd hidden, including that camera. Then why am I still alive? Because we haven't finished with you yet. We need to know who else you've told, what other evidence exists, who else might come looking. Bennett's smile was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "Don't worry, we have all night. And we've learned so much about keeping people conscious during the questioning process." In the distance, I could hear James screaming as the chemical fog finally reached him in the ductwork. The sound echoed through the facility's underground chambers like the cry of the damned. I was about to join him in that hell, and there was nowhere left to run. Bennett's hand shot out like a striking snake, but years of police training saved my life. I dodged left, bringing the camera up to block his improvised surgical tool. Metal sparked against plastic as the device shattered, but the memory card flew free, skittering across the concrete floor into the shadows. "Kill him," Bennett snarled to his men. "Find that memory card." The room erupted into violence as 3 men lunged at me simultaneously. I managed to draw my service weapon, but in the confined space, it was like trying to fight in a coffin. My first shot went wild, shattering pipes and filling the air with steam. The second caught one of Bennett's killers in the shoulder, spinning him around but not stopping him. Then something hit me from behind. Not a fist or weapon, but an industrial wrench swung with killing force. Pain exploded through my skull as I crashed into a wall of pipes, my weapon clattering away into the maze of machinery. "Alive!" Bennett shouted. "We need him alive for questioning." Hands grabbed me from all sides, dragging me deeper into the underground facility. Through a haze of pain and blood, I saw rooms that belonged in the deepest nightmare. Operating tables stained with decades of carnage, walls lined with surgical instruments designed for torture rather than healing, drainage systems that channeled human waste into industrial grinders. They strapped me to a table in a room that stank of death and chemicals. Bennett appeared above me, no longer bothering with his corporate mask. His face was flushed with excitement, his eyes bright with the anticipation of inflicting pain. "Now then, Officer Williams, let's discuss your investigation. Who have you told? What evidence do you have? Who else knows about our operations?" When I didn't answer immediately, he picked up something that looked like a dentist's drill crossed with a cattle prod. "We've had years to perfect our interrogation techniques. Michael Torres lasted 4 hours before he told us everything. I wonder how long you'll hold out." The device touched my arm, and electricity shot through my nervous system like liquid fire. Every muscle convulsed. Every nerve ending screamed. But somehow, I managed not to give him the satisfaction of hearing me scream. "Impressive," Bennett murmured. "You're stronger than most. That will make this more interesting." He adjusted settings on his torture device, and the next shock lasted longer, burning deeper. This time, I couldn't stop the scream that tore from my throat, echoing off the concrete walls like the cry of the damned. "There we go. Now, let's start with simple questions. Have you contacted federal authorities?" When I didn't answer, the electricity came again, longer and stronger. Through the haze of agony, I could see other men working in adjacent rooms, disposing of James Patterson's body, cleaning equipment, preparing for what they clearly expected to be a long night of work. "You know," Bennett said conversationally as he selected a new instrument from his collection, "Michael told us everything eventually. About his camera, about the evidence he'd gathered, about his partner, William Foster. Poor William thought he could hide in Alaska. We found him anyway." He held up a pair of pliers, their metal teeth stained with rust and worse things. These were Michael's least favorite. He became very cooperative once we started removing fingernails. Amazing how quickly a man's principles disappear when faced with genuine pain. The pliers closed around my thumb, and I felt metal teeth bite into flesh. Bennett's face was inches from mine, his breath hot with excitement and madness. "Tell me about Detective Morrison. Is she part of your investigation?" Before he could apply pressure, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Red emergency lights bathed everything in hellish illumination as a computerized voice announced, "Security breach in Sector 7. All personnel to emergency stations." Bennett's face twisted with rage. "Someone's breached the perimeter. You called for backup, didn't you?" I hadn't, but I wasn't about to correct him. Through the chaos, I heard something that made my heart leap with desperate hope. The distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching fast. "FBI!" Bennett snarled. You contacted the goddamn FBI. He raised the pliers to crush my thumb, but one of his men burst through the door. Bennett, federal agents are surrounding the facility, dozens of them. They've got the place locked down tight. Impossible. We have people inside the bureau. We would have been warned. Well, they're here now, and they're armed for war. Bennett's face went through a transformation that was terrifying to witness. From confident predator to cornered animal in the space of seconds. He grabbed a bone saw from his instrument collection, its serrated edge gleaming under the emergency lights. "If I'm going down, you're going with me," he hissed, raising the saw toward my neck. The door exploded inward in a shower of concrete and steel. FBI agents in tactical gear poured into the room, their weapons trained on Bennett and his killers. Red laser dots danced across their chests like deadly fireflies. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Bennett spun toward them, the bone saw still clutched in his hands. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Predator facing predator, madness confronting justice. Then the room erupted in gunfire. Bennett's body jerked as multiple rounds tore through him, spinning him around before he collapsed next to the torture table. His killers dropped their weapons, hands raised in surrender, their faces pale with the knowledge that their reign of terror was over. Agent Sarah Chen approached the table, her face grim as she saw the extent of my injuries. "Officer Williams, can you hear me?" "The memory card," I managed through lips thick with blood. "From Michael's camera. It's in the maintenance room." "We found it, along with a lot more." Her expression was stone cold. "This facility is a crime scene on a scale we've never seen. We're going to need months just to catalog all the evidence." As EMTs worked to free me from the torture table, Agent Chen continued her briefing. "Anonymous tip came in 3 hours ago. Someone called the FBI hotline and reported a police officer in immediate danger at this location. Gave us detailed directions to the underground facility. Who called it in?" "We're still investigating, but the voice was elderly, male, definitely local. Whoever it was saved your life." Later, I would learn it had been James Patterson's brother, who'd become suspicious when James failed to come home. He'd called the facility, and when told James had never shown up for work, he'd known something was terribly wrong. His decision to contact federal authorities instead of local law enforcement probably saved dozens of future victims. The FBI investigation that followed revealed horrors beyond imagination. The underground facility beneath Blackstone Energy contained evidence of systematic murders spanning over a decade. 23 victims were identified through dental records and DNA analysis of bone fragments found in the concrete foundations. But the true scope of the operation was even more staggering. Financial records seized from corporate headquarters revealed a network of similar facilities across 6 states, each one disguised as legitimate oil operations while serving as disposal sites for corporate whistleblowers, regulatory investigators, and anyone else who posed a threat to the organization. Agent Chen briefed me from my hospital bed, her voice hollow with the weight of what they'd discovered. "Michael Torres wasn't investigating oil theft, Officer Williams. He was investigating industrial-scale murder. Blackstone Energy was a front for what we're calling the largest corporate killing operation in American history." The photographs from Michael's camera had led to raids across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, New Mexico, North Dakota, and Alaska. At each site, investigators found similar underground chambers, similar torture equipment, similar walls covered with photographs of victims. "How many people?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "We're still counting, but preliminary estimates suggest over 200 victims across all sites. Environmental engineers, safety inspectors, journalists, union organizers, federal agents, anyone who asked the wrong questions or saw too much. The organizational chart they'd pieced together read like a guide to institutional evil. Charles Bennett had been a mid-level supervisor in a hierarchy that stretched from local killing crews to corporate executives to government officials who'd been bribed or threatened into silence. Thomas Richardson, found alive but traumatized in the facility's holding cells, provided testimony that exposed the selection process. Workers were screened not just for job skills, but for psychological profiles that indicated compliance or resistance. Those who showed signs of curiosity or moral courage were marked for elimination. They turned murder into a business model, Agent Chen explained. Systematic removal of threats to corporate operations, with the bodies serving double duty as concrete aggregate for construction projects. They were literally building their facilities on the bones of their victims. 3 weeks after the raid, I was released from the hospital to a world that felt fundamentally different. The Blackston case had made national headlines, sparking congressional investigations and triggering the largest corporate prosecution in Texas history. But the personal cost was devastating. James Patterson's granddaughter would grow up without knowing how her grandfather had died trying to expose the truth. Michael Torres's children would live with the knowledge that their father had been tortured to death for doing the right thing. William Foster's family in Alaska received his remains in a sealed coffin, with federal agents warning them never to discuss the circumstances of his death. Detective Morrison met me at the hospital exit, her face bearing new lines of stress and exhaustion. "David, there's something you need to know. The investigation isn't over." "What do you mean?" "We've identified over 50 government officials who were on Blackstone's payroll. FBI agents, DEA administrators, federal prosecutors, congressional staffers. The corruption goes all the way to Washington." She handed me a thick folder. "They want you to testify before a grand jury. Multiple grand juries." The folder contained photographs of men and women I'd seen on the news, in newspapers, on television. Respected public servants who'd sold their souls to protect an industrial killing machine. How deep does it go? We don't know yet. Maybe we'll never know. But David, she gripped my arm. You need to understand something. Some of these people are still in positions of power. Some of them are still free. And some of them consider you a threat that needs to be eliminated. As we drove through Midland, I saw Blackstone Energy's former facility in the distance. Yellow tape surrounded the derricks, federal vehicles filled the parking areas, and FBI technicians worked in hazmat suits to process a crime scene that stretched both above and below ground. But I also saw something else. Other oil facilities still operating, their derricks still pumping, their workers still laboring under the Texas sun. How many of them were legitimate operations? How many were fronts for similar horrors? The Blackstone investigation had pulled back the curtain on one small corner of American corporate evil. But the stage was vast, and the play was far from over. The federal courthouse in Dallas felt like a fortress under siege. Security checkpoints, metal detectors, armed marshals at every entrance. All because the Blackstone Energy trials were exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. I testified before 7 different grand juries over the course of 6 months. Each session revealed new layers of the conspiracy, new connections between corporate killers and government officials, new evidence of how thoroughly the system had been corrupted. Charles Bennett was dead, but his superiors were very much alive. The trials began with executives from Blackstone's Houston headquarters, men in expensive suits who'd ordered murders with the casual indifference of accountants balancing spreadsheets. CEO Marcus Blackstone took the stand in his own defense. a silver-haired man who looked like someone's grandfather rather than the architect of industrial genocide. His testimony was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. He'd known nothing, seen nothing, suspected nothing. The systematic murder of over 200 people had been carried out entirely without his knowledge by rogue employees acting against company policy. But the evidence painted a different picture. Email chains showing Blackstone personally approving problem resolution budgets. Recorded phone calls where he discussed permanent solutions to regulatory interference. Financial records showing him personally authorizing payments to government officials. The government's star witness was Daniel Crawford, the corporate representative who tried to intimidate our original investigation. Under federal protection and facing life imprisonment, he'd agreed to reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. Murder wasn't a side effect of our operations, Crawford testified. It was a core business function. We had dedicated teams for elimination, specialized equipment for disposal, established procedures for covering up deaths. It was as systematic and professional as any other corporate department. His testimony revealed the selection criteria used to identify targets. Environmental activists who got too close to illegal dumping operations. Union organizers who pushed too hard for safety improvements. Journalists who asked uncomfortable questions about workplace accidents. Federal investigators who couldn't be bought or intimidated. We maintained active files on over 3,000 potential threats across 6 states, Crawford continued. Each file contained detailed surveillance records, family information, financial vulnerabilities, psychological profiles, everything needed to either control or eliminate the subject. The courtroom fell silent as he described the logistics of industrial murder. Mobile killing teams that could be deployed anywhere within 24 hours. Portable disposal equipment that could reduce a human body to untraceable slurry in less than 4 hours. Corruption networks that ensured investigations would be misdirected or abandoned entirely. But the most chilling revelations came when Crawford detailed the company's expansion plans. We weren't just operating in the oil industry, he testified. We had contracts with mining companies, chemical manufacturers, defense contractors, any corporation that needed permanent solutions to personnel problems. The implications were staggering. American corporations had been outsourcing murder the same way they outsourced manufacturing, to specialists who could do the job cleanly, efficiently, and without leaving evidence that could be traced back to the client. Over the course of the trials, 47 corporate executives and employees were convicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to racketeering to obstruction of justice. The sentences were severe, multiple life terms for the executives, decades in federal prison for their subordinates. But even as justice was served in the courtroom, the real-world consequences continued to unfold. Congressional investigations revealed that Blackstone had been operating with the knowledge and protection of officials in multiple federal agencies. The resulting scandal led to resignations, criminal charges, and a complete reorganization of industrial oversight programs. Maria Torres, Michael's widow, spoke at the final sentencing hearing. Her words were broadcast live across the nation, serving as both eulogy for the victims and warning for future corporate criminals. "My husband died because he believed in truth and justice," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He died because he thought American workers deserved protection from the corporations that employed them. He died because he couldn't stand by and watch while innocent people were murdered to protect profits." She turned to face the defendants, men and women in orange jumpsuits who'd once wielded the power of life and death over anyone who threatened their interests. "You turned murder into a business. You made killing as routine as filing quarterly reports. You destroyed families, corrupted officials, and turned American capitalism into a system based on terror rather than competition. Her voice rose with controlled fury. I hope you spend the rest of your lives remembering the faces of the people you killed. I hope their screams follow you into whatever hell awaits people like you. CEO Marcus Blackstone received 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His final words before being led away were a promise that would haunt me for years. This isn't over. You have no idea how deep this goes or how many people are still out there. We were just one company. There are others, and they're watching. 7 years have passed since the Blackstone Energy trials concluded, but the case continues to shape my life in ways I never expected. The scars on my body have healed, but the psychological wounds run deeper than any torture Bennett inflicted. I wake up some nights thinking I hear footsteps circling my house. I check and recheck the locks on my doors, scan parking lots for suspicious vehicles, avoid routines that might make me predictable to corporate killers who might still be hunting survivors of their exposed operation. The Michael Torres Foundation, established by Maria with money from federal settlements, has become the nation's leading advocate for corporate whistleblower protection. Their hotline receives thousands of calls each year from workers who've discovered evidence of corporate crimes and need protection from retaliation. But for every case that gets investigated, how many others remain hidden? How many companies learned from Blackstone's mistakes and refined their methods of silencing threats? How many people disappear each year not into mysterious accidents, but into industrial disposal systems designed to leave no trace? Thomas Richardson never fully recovered from his ordeal. The chemicals he'd been exposed to in the locker building caused permanent lung damage, and the psychological trauma left him unable to work in industrial settings. He spends his days now as an advocate for workplace safety, traveling to oil fields and manufacturing plants to warn workers about the signs of corporate violence. People think Blackstone was unique, he told me during our last conversation. They think it was an aberration, a single company that went bad. But I know better. I've seen the way corporations operate when they think no one's watching. Blackstone wasn't unique, it was just the one that got caught. The federal task force established to investigate similar operations across the country has identified 17 other companies with suspicious patterns of worker deaths and regulatory violations. But prosecuting them requires evidence, witnesses, and investigators willing to risk their lives pursuing the truth. Agent Sarah Chen, who led the Blackstone investigation, was promoted to head the FBI's Corporate Violence Division, a new department created specifically to investigate industrial murder operations. But even she admits the challenge is overwhelming. We're fighting an enemy that has unlimited resources, political connections, and a willingness to kill anyone who threatens them, she told me. For every Blackstone we shut down, there might be 10 others we never discover. It's like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more grow back. The oil derricks still nod across the Permian Basin, but now I see them differently. Each one represents not just industrial progress, but potential camouflage for corporate crimes. Each facility could be hiding underground chambers where people are tortured and killed for asking inconvenient questions. Detective Morrison retired 2 years ago, citing burnout and health problems related to the stress of the Blackstone investigation. But before she left, she pulled me aside for a final warning. David, you need to understand something. The people we put in prison were middle management. The real power behind operations like Blackstone never shows its face in court. They're still out there, still operating, still killing anyone who gets too close to the truth. She handed me a thick file containing surveillance reports, financial records, and photographs of men and women who'd never been charged with any crime. These are the ones who got away, the ones with enough money and influence to stay hidden while their subordinates took the fall. If you ever see any of these faces, if any of these names surface in your investigations, you call federal authorities immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. The file remains locked in my home safe, a reminder that free to build new ones. Every time I respond to an industrial accident, I wonder if it's really an accident. Every time a worker dies under suspicious circumstances, I think about Michael Torres and the price he paid for trying to expose the truth. Every time a whistleblower comes forward with evidence of corporate wrongdoing, I worry about what might happen to them if their identity becomes known. The Blackstone Energy case taught me that American capitalism has a shadow side, where murder is just another business expense and human lives are disposable commodities. It showed me that some corporations will kill to protect their profits, and that government officials can be bought or intimidated into allowing industrial genocide to continue. But it also taught me that individual courage can overcome institutional corruption. Michael Torres, armed with nothing but a camera and a determination to do the right thing, exposed a conspiracy that might otherwise have continued for decades. His death wasn't in vain. It saved the lives of countless future victims and led to systemic changes in how corporate crimes are investigated and prosecuted. The case is officially closed, the trials are over, and justice has been served according to the law. But in a deeper sense, the case will never be closed. As long as corporations prioritize profits over people, as long as government officials can be corrupted by money and power, as long as workers can be silenced by violence and intimidation, the spirit of Blackstone Energy lives on. My job now is to remember the lessons of that nightmare and to watch for signs that it's happening again. Because somewhere in America, in some industrial facility disguised as legitimate business, corporate killers are planning their next move in the endless war between greed and justice. The oil flows, the derricks pump, and the Texas sky stretches endlessly overhead. But beneath the surface, in the shadows where profits are measured in blood and success is calculated in silence, the real America conducts its darkest business. Michael Torres died trying to bring that darkness into the light. The least I can do is make sure his sacrifice continues to illuminate the path toward truth, no matter how many corporate killers are waiting in the shadows to snuff out that light forever. The midnight shift continues, and somewhere in the darkness, another worker is discovering something they shouldn't know. Another person is taking photographs they shouldn't take. Another voice is preparing to speak truth to power. The question isn't whether corporate killers will try to silence that voice. The question is whether there will be someone there to hear the screams and do something about them before it's too late. In the oil fields of Texas, the answer to that question means the difference between life and death, between justice and corporate genocide, between a society governed by law and one ruled by the ruthless calculus of profit at any human cost. The case files from Blackstone Energy fill an entire warehouse now, evidence of crimes that shocked the nation and changed the way America thinks about corporate power. But more importantly, they serve as a warning about what happens when ordinary people stop asking questions, stop demanding answers, and stop fighting for justice. Michael Torres asked questions and died for it, but his questions exposed a truth that saved hundreds of lives and brought dozens of killers to justice. In the end, that may be the most any of us can hope for, that our courage in the face of overwhelming evil might make a difference, might save a life, might tip the balance toward justice in a world that often seems rigged in favor of those with the most money and the fewest scruples. The Texas oil fields remember Michael Torres, and they always will. His story proves that heroes aren't always the ones who survive, but sometimes they're the ones who die trying to protect others from the monsters that hide behind corporate logos and executive titles. The real horror of Blackstone Energy wasn't supernatural. it was entirely human. And that makes it infinitely more terrifying than any ghost story, because it could happen again, anywhere, anytime corporate greed decides that murder is an acceptable business practice. The case is closed, but the vigilance continues. Because in America, the price of freedom isn't just eternal vigilance against foreign enemies, it's eternal vigilance against the enemies within, the ones who wear suits instead of uniforms and kill with industrial equipment instead of weapons of war. The midnight shift ends when the sun rises, but the darkness it reveals never truly goes away. It just finds new places to hide, new victims to claim, new ways to turn the American dream into an American nightmare. And somewhere in that darkness, another Michael Torres is about to discover something that will cost him everything, but might save us all. The call came in at 11:23 a.m. on a Sunday morning that had started peaceful enough. I was sitting in my patrol car outside Calvary Baptist Church in Cedar Ridge, watching families file out after service, when my radio crackled with the kind of urgency that turns a quiet Texas morning into something you'll never forget. Unit 12. We have a 1054 at the Brennan Ranch, Farm Road 1174. Possible homicide. Multiple units requested. I grabbed the radio, my coffee suddenly tasting like copper pennies. Unit 12 responding. ETA 20 minutes. The drive to the Brennan spread took me through hill country that looked like a postcard. Rolling hills covered in live oak and mesquite. Cattle grazing in fields green from recent rains. Old homesteads that had weathered a century of Texas summers. But the beauty felt wrong somehow. Like a pretty face hiding something rotten underneath. The Brennan Ranch had been in the same family since 1847, when old Irish immigrant Patrick Brennan had claimed 2,000 acres through a Mexican land grant. 5 generations later, it was still working ranch land, though the acreage had dwindled through bad times and family feuds to about 800 acres of prime grazing land that several people had died trying to claim. As I turned onto the ranch's Kalishi Road, I saw the emergency vehicles already gathered around the main house, a 2-story Victorian that had seen better decades. The house sat on a rise overlooking the property like a fortress, its wraparound porch and gingerbread trim now weathered gray as old bones. Ambulance doors stood open, and I could see county coroner vehicles parked in the shade of ancient live oaks that had probably witnessed more death than any trees had a right to see. Sheriff Patricia Mason met me at the gate, her weathered face grim under her Stetson. She'd been working this county for 25 years and had seen every kind of violence Texas could produce, but something in her eyes told me this case was different. "What do we have, Sheriff?" Edgar Brennan, age 67, found dead in his barn about 2 hours ago. She gestured toward a massive red structure about 100 yards from the house. His daughter Margaret called it in. Says she found him when she came to check on the morning chores. We walked toward the barn, our boots crunching on gravel that seemed too loud in the unnatural quiet of the place. No cattle lowing, no horses whickering, no sound except the whisper of wind through oak leaves and the distant buzz of flies drawn to fresh blood. Any witnesses? Margaret was the only one on the property. Edgar's been living alone since his wife died 2 years ago. Margaret lives in town but comes out every morning to help with the animals. Sheriff Mason paused at the barn door. "David, before you go in there, you need to understand something about this family. The Brennans have been feuding with their neighbors, the Murdochs, for over 100 years. Started with a boundary dispute in 1923 and just kept getting worse. How much worse? 3 deaths in the past 40 years, all ruled accidental or natural causes. Edgar's brother Thomas died in a hunting accident in 1984. caught a stray bullet from the Murdoch property during deer season. Edgar's nephew Robert was killed in a car wreck in 1998. Ran off the road on a curve that borders Murdoch land. Edgar's son-in-law died of a heart attack last year, age 35, right after he started pushing Edgar to file a lawsuit over water rights. The pattern was starting to emerge, and it made my blood run cold. You think the Murdochs have been systematically eliminating the Brennan family? I think there's been too many convenient accidents over the years, and now Edgar's dead, leaving only his daughter Margaret to inherit the ranch. Sheriff Mason pulled open the barn door, releasing a wave of humid air thick with the smell of hay, livestock, and fresh death. The question is whether this was another accident or whether someone finally got tired of waiting for nature to take its course. The inside of the barn was a cathedral of shadow and dust motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. Stalls lined both sides of a central aisle that stretched toward the back of the building, and the smell of horses and hay should have been comforting, but instead felt oppressive, like breathing in the exhales of ghosts. Edgar Brennan's body lay in the center aisle, but something was wrong with the scene immediately. He was positioned too carefully, laid out with his arms at his sides and his legs straight, like someone had arranged him for viewing. His clothes were clean, except for dark stains around a head wound that looked far too precise to be accidental. County Coroner Dr. Lisa Rodriguez knelt beside the body, her camera documenting details that would haunt crime scene photos for years to come. She looked up as we approached, her face pale despite 20 years of examining violent deaths. "Sheriff, this wasn't an accident. Mr. Brennan was struck repeatedly with something heavy and blunt, probably a hammer or similar tool. The positioning suggests he was moved after death, arranged by someone who wanted to send a message." "What kind of message?" Dr. Rodriguez pointed to Edgar's hands, which were crossed over his chest in a position that mimicked peaceful death. But someone had placed objects between his fingers, old barbed wire twisted into crude shapes that looked almost ritualistic. This is deliberate staging. Someone wanted him found this way, wanted us to see these symbols. She carefully photographed the wire formations before bagging them as evidence. I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of forensic work. I studied the barn more carefully, looking for signs of struggle or evidence of the killer's presence. The hay was disturbed in several places, suggesting a fight had taken place. Drag marks in the dirt floor led from a horse stall to where the body now lay, and on the walls, barely visible in the dim light, someone had carved symbols that matched the twisted wire, crude drawings that looked like territorial markers or warnings. How long has he been dead? Based on rigor mortis and body temperature, I'd estimate death occurred between 6 and 8 a.m. But here's the strange part. His daughter says she found him at 9:30, which means someone had time to kill him, arrange the body, and stage the scene before she arrived. The implications were chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment attack. Someone had planned Edgar Brennan's murder, executed it with cold precision, and taken time to turn his death into some kind of ritualistic display. "Sheriff, I need to interview the daughter, and I want to talk to the Murdoch family about their whereabouts this morning. The Murdochs live about 2 miles north of here, but David—" Sheriff Mason's voice carried a warning that made my spine crawl. "Be careful how you approach them. The current patriarch is James Murdoch, Edgar's age, and he's got 2 sons and a grandson who've all inherited the family hatred for the Brennans. They're not violent criminals, but when it comes to this land dispute, they're not entirely rational either." As we left the barn, I took one last look at the crime scene. Edgar Brennan's body lay in a pool of Texas sunlight, surrounded by the tools and hay of honest ranch work. But his death had transformed this place from a working barn into something that felt cursed. The twisted, barbed wire symbols seemed to writhe in the shifting light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were looking at more than just murder. This felt like the opening move in a war that had been brewing for a century, and Edgar Brennan had been the first casualty in what might become a bloodbath that would consume both families before it was finished. The hill country stretched endlessly in all directions, its rolling hills and hidden valleys perfect for concealing the kind of secrets that festered across generations. Somewhere out there, Edgar Brennan's killer was probably watching, waiting to see how law enforcement would respond to their carefully staged message. And somewhere else, the Murdoch family was either planning their next move or preparing to defend themselves against accusations that might or might not be justified. The truth was buried somewhere in a century of feuding, but digging it up might unleash violence that would make Edgar's ritualistic murder look like a gentle warning. The peaceful Sunday morning had become the start of something that felt less like a police investigation and more like stepping into the middle of a blood feud that stretched back to the days when Texas was still a republic, and justice was measured in acres gained or lost, lives taken or spared, and the kind of hatred that could burn across generations like a wildfire that never quite died out. Margaret Brennan sat on her father's front porch, clutching a coffee cup with hands that shook like autumn leaves. She was a woman in her early 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent her life working outdoors. But this morning she looked fragile as spun glass, her eyes red from crying and something else. Something that might have been fear. "Miss Brennan, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about this morning." She nodded, not trusting her voice. The porch creaked under our weight as I settled into a chair that had probably held 5 generations of Brennans, all of them watching the same horizon, all of them guarding the same land. "What time did you arrive at the ranch?" "About 9:15. I come out every morning to help Daddy with the feeding. He was getting too old to handle all the work alone." Her voice cracked on the past tense, the reality of loss hitting her in waves. "Did you notice anything unusual? Any vehicles that shouldn't have been here? Any signs of disturbance?" Margaret set down her coffee cup and wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold pieces together that were threatening to fall apart. "The horses were spooked. Soon as I drove up, I could tell something was wrong. They were all bunched up in the far corner of the pasture, acting like something had scared them real bad." "What scared them?" "I don't know. But horses can sense things people can't. Evil things." She looked at me with eyes that held the kind of knowledge that comes from generations of hard living and harder deaths. "Officer, my family's been dying for 40 years. One by one, all the men get taken. And now, there's just me left." "Tell me about the feud with the Murdoch family." Margaret's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the hills. "It started with my great-grandfather and old Sean Murdoch back in 1923. Boundary dispute over about 50 acres of bottomland along Cypress Creek, best grazing and water rights in the county. Should have been settled in court, but both families were too proud and too poor to hire good lawyers." "What happened?" "Sean Murdoch moved his fence line about 100 yards onto our property, claimed the land had always been his. Great-grandfather Patrick moved it back. Sean moved it again. Patrick moved it back and put up no trespassing signs. Sean tore down the signs and moved the fence again." She stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over land that had been bought with Irish sweat and defended with Irish blood. "Then Sean's cattle started disappearing. Found them shot and left to rot in the disputed area. Patrick's barn burned down. Sean's well was poisoned. Tit for tat, getting worse every year." "When did it turn deadly?" 1928. Patrick's youngest son, my grandfather Michael, caught Sean Murdoch cutting our fence in broad daylight. They fought, and Michael ended up with a pitchfork through his chest. Sean claimed self-defense, said Michael came at him with a rifle. Case went to court, but Sean had witnesses and Michael was dead. Jury ruled it justified homicide. The pattern was becoming clearer. A cycle of retaliation and escalation that had been building for nearly a century. And it's continued since then. Every generation, someone dies. Usually the men, usually in ways that look like accidents or self-defense. My Uncle Thomas in '84, hunting accident that put a bullet through his heart on opening day of deer season. My cousin Robert in '98 ran his truck off the road at midnight, but the skid mark showed he was forced off by another vehicle. My brother-in-law, Jake, last year, heart attack at 35, but he'd been getting death threats for weeks before he died. Margaret turned back to me, and I could see something in her eyes that went beyond grief into territory that touched on madness. Officer, that family is cursed, and they've been spreading that curse to anyone who tries to stop them. Cursed? How? Look at their history. 4 generations of Murdochs, and every one of them has died violent. Old Sean got kicked in the head by a horse in 1932. His son William was killed in Korea. Friendly fire, they said, but the man who shot him was from this county and knew about the feud. William's son Robert died in Vietnam, and his son James lost his wife and youngest boy in a car wreck 10 years ago. She pulled out a worn photograph from her pocket, a family portrait showing the Murdochs from happier times. Even in the faded image, there was something unsettling about their faces, something that suggested violence was always just beneath the surface. They say, evil calls to evil, officer. The Murdochs have been killing my family for so long, they can't stop. It's in their blood now, part of who they are. And they won't stop until every Brennan is dead and they own this land. Margaret, do you have any evidence that the Murdochs were involved in your father's death? She was quiet for a long time, staring out at the hills that rolled toward the Murdoch property like green waves frozen in time. Last week, Daddy found fresh tire tracks on our south pasture. Big truck, diesel, same kind James Murdoch drives. Found some of our fence posts pulled up and moved. Found dead cats nailed to trees along our property line. Dead cats? 3 of them. House cats looked like they'd been tortured before they were killed, nailed to oak trees with rusty nails, positioned so you'd see them if you were riding the fence line. She shuddered. Daddy said it was psychological warfare, trying to scare us off the land. But I think it was worse than that. I think they were practicing. The implications made my stomach lurch. If the Murdochs had been escalating from property harassment to animal torture, Edgar Brennan's ritualistic murder might have been the next step in a progression toward something even more horrific. Did your father report the dead cats? Who would he report it to? Sheriff Mason's been trying to keep peace between our families for 25 years. She knows if this feud explodes into open violence, people are going to die. Lots of people. Margaret walked back to her chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than her 40-something years. Officer, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about 50 acres of bottomland anymore. This is about a century of hatred that's been passed down like a family heirloom. Every Murdoch child grows up learning to hate the Brennans. Every Brennan child learns the same thing in reverse. What happens now? You're the last Brennan. Now, they wait for me to die or sell out and move away. Give them a few months and I'll probably have an accident too. Car wreck maybe, or a fall from a horse. Something that looks natural but isn't. She met my eyes with a gaze that held the accumulated pain of 5 generations. Unless you can prove they killed Daddy and put them in prison where they belong. As I left the Brennan Ranch, driving toward the Murdoch property for what would undoubtedly be a hostile interview, I couldn't shake Margaret's words about family curses. The rational part of my mind rejected supernatural explanations for the cycle of violence, but the evidence was undeniable. Both families had been dying for decades in ways that stretched coincidence past the breaking point. The hill country around me looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, but I was beginning to understand that this was a landscape shaped by violence. Every fence line was a potential battlefield. Every property marker a monument to someone who died defending their claim to Texas soil. And somewhere ahead of me, the Murdoch family was either planning their next move or preparing to defend themselves against accusations that might finally bring their century-long war to an end. The question was whether I could solve Edgar Brennan's murder before the feud claimed more victims, and whether I might become one of those victims myself if I got too close to the truth about what these families had been doing to each other for the past 100 years. The Murdoch property sprawled across the valley like a military installation designed for siege warfare. Unlike the Brennan Ranch with its single Victorian house, the Murdoch compound consisted of multiple buildings: the main house, several smaller residences for family members, barns, workshops, and storage buildings, all connected by graveled roads and surrounded by fencing that looked more designed to keep people out than livestock in. As I drove through their front gate, I counted at least 6 vehicles parked around the compound: pickup trucks, ATVs, and a diesel dually that matched Margaret's description of the truck that had been trespassing on Brennan property. Every building had clear sight lines to the others, and I noticed that several windows had been modified to provide better observation points for watching the approaches. James Murdoch met me in the front yard, and immediately I understood why the Brennan family found these people so intimidating. He was a tall, lean man in his late 60s with silver hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance while revealing nothing of his own thoughts. His handshake was firm enough to be a warning, and his smile never reached those calculating eyes. "Officer, I heard about Edgar's death. Terrible thing. We may have had our differences, but I wouldn't wish that kind of end on anyone. Mr. Murdoch, I need to ask you and your family about your whereabouts this morning between 6 and 10 a.m. "Of course. We were all here for Sunday breakfast. Family tradition." He gestured toward 2 men who'd emerged from the main house, both carrying themselves with the same predatory alertness as their father. "My sons, William and Robert, and my grandson Daniel should be around somewhere." William Murdoch was in his early 40s, built like a linebacker with hands that looked capable of crushing skulls without much effort. Robert was younger and leaner, but had the same pale eyes and calculating smile as his father. When they shook hands, I felt calluses that spoke of hard work and possibly harder violence. "We understand Edgar was found in his barn," William said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Irish or might have been something else entirely. "Terrible accident from what we hear. Actually, we're treating it as a homicide investigation. Mr. Brennan was murdered." The 3 men exchanged glances that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. It was the kind of look that passed between people who shared dangerous secrets, and it made every instinct I developed in 15 years of police work start screaming warnings. Murdered? James Murdoch's surprise seemed genuine, but there was something else in his expression, something that might have been satisfaction. Who would want to kill Edgar? That's what we're trying to determine. I understand your families have had some disputes over the years. Robert Murdoch laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Disputes? Officer, that's like calling the Civil War a minor disagreement. The Brennans and Murdochs have been at each other's throats for 100 years. Tell me about the recent problems. Fence lines being moved, dead animals on Brennan property. The temperature in the conversation dropped about 20 degrees. James Murdoch's friendly facade cracked enough to reveal something cold and predatory underneath. I don't know anything about dead animals. As for fence lines, the boundary between our properties has been disputed since the 1920s. We maintain our legal right to property that was illegally claimed by the Brennan family. Do you have documentation to support that claim? We have surveys, deeds, court records, and witness statements going back 90 years. The Brennans stole 50 acres of prime bottomland from my grandfather, and every generation since has tried to legitimize that theft. William pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. We've been preparing a lawsuit to recover what's rightfully ours. I examined the documents, which seemed professionally prepared and meticulously organized. Property surveys, legal briefs, historical records, witness affidavits. It was the kind of comprehensive case that suggested years of preparation. This is quite an extensive file. How long have you been working on this lawsuit? About 2 years, ever since Edgar started making noise about selling the ranch. We couldn't let him transfer stolen property to some outside buyer without first establishing our legal claim. James Murdoch's eyes had gone completely cold. Officer, my family has been patient for nearly a century. We've tried to resolve this through proper legal channels, but patience has limits. That sounded uncomfortably close to a threat. Mr. Murdoch, are you saying your family was prepared to take action if the legal system didn't give you what you wanted? I'm saying we've been preparing for all contingencies. Before I could ask what that meant, a fourth man emerged from one of the outbuildings. Daniel Murdoch looked to be in his mid-20s, but there was something unsettling about him that went beyond the family resemblance. His movements were too fluid, too controlled, like a predator that had learned to mimic human behavior without quite mastering it. Grandpa, I finished cleaning the equipment. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something underneath that made my skin crawl. Daniel, this is Officer Williams. He's investigating Edgar Brennan's death. Daniel's smile was perhaps the most disturbing thing I'd seen all day. Mr. Brennan's dead? How terrible. He was such a fixture in the community. The way he emphasized fixture made it sound like he was discussing the removal of an obstruction rather than the death of a human being. And there was something about his hands that drew my attention. They were meticulously clean, scrubbed in a way that suggested recent contact with something that needed to be washed off thoroughly. Daniel, what kind of equipment were you cleaning? Just ranch equipment, tools and such. We like to keep everything in good condition. His smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. A tool that isn't properly maintained can be dangerous. Someone could get hurt. I made a mental note to request a search warrant for the Murdoch property. If they'd been preparing for all contingencies regarding the land dispute, some of their tools might show traces of Edgar Brennan's blood. I'll need to verify your alibi for this morning. All 4 of you were here between 6 and 10 a.m. Family breakfast at 7:30, James confirmed. We can provide witnesses. My sister Mary lives in the White House over there, and she was here. My nephew Thomas and his wife were here with their children. About 12 people total. It was a solid alibi, too solid, perhaps. In my experience, when an entire family had identical stories about their whereabouts during a murder, it usually meant they'd had time to coordinate their lies. I may need to speak with those witnesses individually. Of course, we have nothing to hide. James Murdoch's smile returned, but it didn't improve the temperature of his eyes. Officer, I hope you find Edgar's killer quickly. This county doesn't need that kind of violence spreading. As I prepared to leave, Daniel Murdoch approached my patrol car. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His movements too precise, his smile too practiced, his eyes too empty of anything resembling normal human emotion. Officer Williams, you might want to be careful. Driving these country roads, lots of accidents happen out here. Curves are tricky, especially at night. He glanced toward the Brennan property, visible across the valley. People who don't know the territory sometimes make mistakes. It was a threat delivered with the tone of helpful advice, but the message was unmistakable. The Murdoch family wanted me to understand that investigating Edgar Brennan's murder might be hazardous to my health. As I drove away from the compound, I could feel eyes watching me from multiple windows. The Murdochs weren't just a family, they were a clan, organized and coordinated in ways that suggested they'd been preparing for conflict for generations. Their compound was set up like a fortress. Their alibi was synchronized like a military operation, and their youngest member had just threatened a police officer with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for violence. The rational part of my mind rejected Margaret Brennan's talk of family curses, but the evidence was mounting that both families had been shaped by a century of violence into something that wasn't quite normal. The Brennans had been reduced to a single surviving member who lived in constant fear. The Murdochs had evolved into something that resembled a criminal organization more than a ranching family. And somewhere in the space between those two extremes, Edgar Brennan had been murdered with ritualistic precision by someone who wanted to send a message that was only partially about land ownership. The barbed wire symbols, the careful staging, the psychological warfare. It felt like the opening move in a campaign designed to drive Margaret Brennan off the property or into madness. The question was whether I could build a case against the Murdochs before they eliminated the last witness to their century of violence. Because if Margaret Brennan died, the truth about what these families had been doing to each other would be buried with her, and the Murdochs would finally have what they'd been killing for since 1923. The hill country sunset painted everything in shades of blood and gold, but the beauty felt tainted by the knowledge of what had happened in that barn and what was probably going to happen next. Somewhere in those rolling hills, a family of killers was planning their next move, and somewhere else, a terrified woman was waiting for them to come for her. I had maybe days, maybe hours, to figure out how to prove a murder that had been committed by people who'd spent a century learning how to kill without leaving evidence that would stand up in court. The next morning brought a break in the case that I wasn't sure I wanted. Dr. Rodriguez called at 6 a.m. with autopsy results that turned Edgar Brennan's murder from a family feud into something much darker. "David, you need to see this. Can you come to the morgue immediately?" I drove through downtown Cedar Ridge as it was waking up. Cafe lights coming on, early commuters heading to Austin, the normal rhythm of small-town Texas life. But the normalcy felt like a facade hiding something rotten, especially after what I'd seen at the Murdoch compound. The county morgue occupied the basement of the courthouse, a sterile environment that always smelled like disinfectant and death. Dr. Rodriguez met me at the entrance, her face grim with the kind of knowledge that changes how you see the world. Edgar Brennan wasn't just murdered, he was tortured. Systematically, professionally, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She led me to an examination room where Edgar's body lay under harsh fluorescent lights that made his injuries look even more horrific. What I'd taken for simple blunt force trauma was actually a pattern of wounds that spoke of hours of careful, deliberate torture. "Look at these marks." Dr. Rodriguez pointed to small circular burns on Edgar's arms and chest. Cigarette burns, but applied in a specific pattern, and these cuts, she indicated shallow slices on his hands and feet. They're designed to cause maximum pain without killing the victim quickly. How long was he tortured? Based on the healing patterns and blood coagulation, at least 3 hours, maybe 4. Whoever did this wanted information from him, and they were willing to take their time getting it. I studied the photographs she'd taken, trying to maintain professional detachment while looking at evidence of systematic brutality. Any idea what they might have been trying to learn? Can't say for certain, but look at this. She showed me close-up images of Edgar's hands. His fingernails were partially removed, and there are distinctive marks around his fingers consistent with someone trying to force him to write or sign something. The implications hit me like ice water. They were trying to make him sign over the ranch. That would be my guess. Torture him until he agrees to sell the property or change his will, then kill him to prevent him from recanting later. Dr. Rodriguez closed the file with hands that weren't quite steady. David, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen anything this calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a business transaction conducted with torture and murder. As I drove back toward the Brennan Ranch, my mind was spinning with the implications. If the Murdaughs had tortured Edgar to get control of the property, they might have succeeded. His signature on a sale document or will change could be legally valid even if it was obtained under duress, especially if no one could prove coercion. Margaret Brennan was waiting for me on her father's porch, but she looked different than she had the day before. The grief was still there, but underneath it was something that might have been relief, or might have been fear. Margaret, I need to ask you about your father's will and any recent property transactions. Her face went pale. Why? What did you find? The medical examiner believes your father was tortured before he was killed. Someone may have forced him to sign legal documents. Margaret stood up so quickly her coffee cup shattered on the porch floor. Oh God, oh Jesus, I knew something was wrong when I went through his papers yesterday. What did you find? She led me into the house, through rooms that felt heavy with the weight of 5 generations of family history. The walls were covered with photographs. Brennans working the land, raising families, building the ranch into something worth killing for. In the study, papers were scattered across an old oak desk in a way that suggested desperate searching. Daddy always kept his important documents in this desk: will, property deeds, insurance policies. But yesterday when I looked for his will, I found this instead. She handed me a legal document that made my blood run cold. It was a sale agreement transferring the entire Brennan Ranch to the Murdaugh family for the token sum of $1. The signature looked like Edgar's, but it was shaky and uneven, as if written by someone under extreme duress. This is dated yesterday morning at 7:30 a.m. Right around the time he was being tortured. Margaret sank into her father's chair, looking suddenly older than her years. They made him sign over everything before they killed him. I examined the document more carefully. It was professionally prepared, notarized, and legally binding. Exactly the kind of paperwork you'd expect from people who'd spent years planning this moment. Margaret, this document is notarized. Do you recognize the notary's name? She looked at the signature and her face went even paler. Sarah Murdaugh. That's James Murdaugh's sister. The conspiracy was deeper than I'd realized. They hadn't just murdered Edgar. They'd orchestrated a complete takeover of the Brennan property using family members in positions of public trust to legitimize their theft. We need to check the county records office. If they've filed this document, they might be trying to take possession of the property immediately. The drive to the courthouse took us through downtown Cedar Ridge, past storefronts and houses where generations of residents had lived and died while the Brennan-Murdaugh feud simmered just beneath the surface of community life. How many people knew what was happening? How many were complicit through silence or active participation? At the records office, my worst fears were confirmed. The sale document had been filed at 9 a.m. on Sunday, less than 2 hours after Edgar's estimated time of death. The Murdaughs had been so confident of their plan that they'd had a notary standing by to legitimize the forced sale immediately. "This is legally binding," the clerk explained. "Proper signatures, proper notarization, proper filing. As of Sunday morning, the Murdaugh family legally owns the Brennan Ranch." Margaret stared at the filed documents as if they were a death sentence. They did it. After 100 years, they finally won. But something was bothering me about the timeline. "Margaret, if this sale went through on Sunday morning, why haven't the Murdaughs taken possession of the property? Why haven't they evicted you?" I don't know. Maybe they're waiting for Daddy's funeral. Or maybe they're waiting for you to die, too." The words hung in the air between us like a curse. If Margaret died in an accident, the Murdaughs would inherit the property without any surviving family members to contest the forced sale. They'd finally have clear title to the disputed land, and any investigation into Edgar's murder would lose its primary witness. "Margaret, I think you're in immediate danger. These people have spent a century perfecting their methods of killing Brennans and making it look accidental. You need protection." "From who?" "The sheriff's department has 2 deputies and a part-time investigator." "You think that's going to stop a family that's been committing murder for 4 generations?" She had a point. The Murdaughs had demonstrated organizational skills, patience, and ruthlessness that suggested they'd been planning this final assault for years. They had legal documentation giving them claim to the property, family members in positions of public trust to legitimize their actions, and a track record of eliminating threats without leaving prosecutable evidence. As we left the courthouse, I noticed a familiar diesel pickup truck parked across the street. Daniel Murdaugh sat behind the wheel, watching us with that disturbing smile that never reached his empty eyes. When he saw me looking, he touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute and started the engine. The message was clear. They were watching Margaret, waiting for the right moment to complete their century-long campaign of genocide against the Brennan family. And they were confident enough in their planning to make sure we knew they were watching. "Margaret, do you have somewhere safe you can stay? Friends or family outside the county? This ranch is all I have left. If I run away, they win. If I stay..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. If she stayed, she'd probably die in an accident within days. But maybe that was exactly what we needed to happen. "Margaret, I want you to consider something that's going to sound crazy. What if we let them think their plan is working? What if we use you as bait to catch them in the act?" Her face went white as bleached bone. "You want me to wait here for them to kill me. I want you to appear to be here, while actually being somewhere safe. We set up surveillance, bring in undercover officers, and catch them when they come to finish what they started." It was a dangerous plan, but it might be our only chance to get evidence that would stick. The Murdaughs had been killing Brennans for decades without leaving prosecutable evidence, but if we could catch them in the act of attempting another murder, we'd finally have something that could put them away. As we discussed the details, I kept thinking about Daniel Murdaugh's empty eyes and practiced smile. Something about him went beyond ordinary family hatred into territory that touched on genuine mental illness. He wasn't just willing to kill for the family cause, he was eager to kill, probably enjoyed it, and had been carefully trained by older generations who'd refined murder into an art form. The question wasn't whether the Murdaughs would try to kill Margaret Brennan. The question was whether we could catch them doing it without getting her killed in the process. Because if we failed, the last member of the Brennan family would join her ancestors in the hill country soil, and a century of systematic murder would finally achieve its goal. The Murdaughs would have their stolen land, their legal documentation, and their perfect record of eliminating threats without consequences. And somewhere in those rolling hills, other families with other feuds would learn that in Texas, patience and ruthlessness could triumph over law and justice, no matter how many people died in the process. 3 days after we'd discovered the forged sale documents, Margaret Brennan was supposed to die. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. She would have a tragic accident while attempting to move her belongings from the ranch, probably a fall from the barn loft or a mishap with some piece of farm equipment. The Murdochs would express appropriate sympathy while quietly taking possession of property they now legally owned. Instead, Margaret was safely hidden in a safe house 20 miles away, while Deputy Sarah Martinez, wearing a wig and Margaret's clothes, went through the motions of packing up a lifetime of family memories. Electronic surveillance equipment hidden throughout the property would capture whatever the Murdochs tried to do, finally providing the evidence we needed to break their century-long cycle of murder. That was the plan, anyway. I sat in a concealed observation post in the barn loft, watching through night vision equipment as Martinez moved around the main house like a woman consumed by grief and fear. She'd volunteered for the assignment despite understanding that the Murdochs had probably spent decades perfecting their murder techniques. Her courage reminded me why I'd joined law enforcement in the first place. Sometimes good people had to risk everything to stop evil from spreading. The ranch felt different at night. Sounds carried further across the empty pastures, and shadows seemed to move with purpose rather than simply shifting with the breeze. Coyotes howled in the distance, but their voices seemed mournful tonight, as if they were mourning deaths that hadn't happened yet. At 11:47 p.m., they came. I spotted them through the night vision scope first, 4 figures moving across the pasture with the fluid coordination of a military unit. They wore dark clothing and moved in formation, using hand signals to coordinate their approach. These weren't angry neighbors acting on impulse. These were experienced predators executing a plan they'd probably rehearsed dozens of times. James Murdoch led the group, followed by his sons William and Robert, with Daniel bringing up the rear. Each carried equipment, rope, tools, items that could be used to stage an accident or dispose of evidence. Daniel carried something extra, a bag that clinked softly with what sounded like glass containers. Acid, maybe, or accelerants for a fire that would destroy forensic evidence. They reached the house without triggering our perimeter alarms, demonstrating knowledge of the property that could only come from extensive surveillance. James posted William at the back door while Robert covered the front. Daniel disappeared around the side of the house, probably heading for the electrical connections that would plunge the interior into darkness. My radio crackled softly with Martinez's voice. Contact. 4 subjects approaching the house. I'm moving to the predetermined fallback position. The plan called for Martinez to retreat to the barn when the Murdochs made their move, leading them into the kill zone where we had the best surveillance coverage and the most tactical advantage. But plans have a way of falling apart when they meet reality, especially when that reality involves people who'd spent generations learning how to kill efficiently. The house lights went out. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but nothing happened. Daniel had apparently disabled more than just the main electrical supply. In the sudden darkness, Martinez would be moving by feel and memory, trying to reach safety while avoiding the family of killers who were undoubtedly entering the house through multiple points. Through my night vision, I watched Daniel reappear at the front of the house. Instead of following his family inside, he was heading directly toward the barn, toward my position and Martinez's planned escape route. Somehow, he'd anticipated our strategy and moved to cut off the retreat. This wasn't just a murder attempt, it was a counter-ambush by people who'd suspected law enforcement surveillance from the beginning. Daniel entered the barn through the main doors, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He carried a tactical flashlight in one hand, and something that looked like a tranquilizer gun in the other. Whatever was in that bag clinked as he moved, glass containers filled with chemicals that probably served purposes I didn't want to contemplate. I keyed my radio for backup, but got only static. They'd jammed our communications along with killing the power. We were on our own until our failure to check in triggered the emergency response protocol, which wouldn't happen for another 30 minutes. Martinez had made it to the barn, but she was trapped in the lower level while Daniel hunted her with equipment that suggested he'd done this many times before. Through the infrared scope, I could see heat signatures moving in the darkness below. Predator and prey engaged in a deadly game of hide-and-seek. Daniel's voice drifted up from the barn floor, soft and conversational. "Deputy Martinez? There's no point in hiding. We know you're not really Margaret Brennan. We've known about the surveillance from the beginning. How was that possible? Unless the realization hit me like ice water. The Murdochs had sources inside law enforcement. Someone had told them about our operation, probably the same someone who'd been helping them avoid prosecution for decades. They hadn't come here to murder Margaret Brennan. They'd come to eliminate the law enforcement officers who were getting too close to their secrets. "We've been watching your department for years," Daniel continued, his voice growing closer to Martinez's position. "Amazing how many people can be bought or intimidated into cooperation. Sheriff Mason has been very helpful, though she doesn't know it." A gunshot echoed through the barn, followed by Martinez's scream. Daniel had found her. I moved as quietly as possible toward the ladder that led down from the loft, but Daniel's voice stopped me. "Officer Williams, I know you're up there. Come down slowly, or I'll start taking Deputy Martinez apart piece by piece." The tranquilizer gun hadn't been for Martinez. It had been for me. Daniel had known exactly where everyone would be positioned because someone had given him our operational plan. We'd walked into a trap that had been carefully designed to eliminate the last threats to the Murdoch family's century of murder. I climbed down the ladder with my hands visible, knowing that any sudden movement would result in Martinez's death and probably my own. Daniel waited at the bottom, that disturbing smile wider than ever, his eyes bright with anticipation of the violence to come. Martinez sat on the barn floor, clutching her shoulder where Daniel's shot had taken her down. Blood seeped between her fingers, but she was conscious and alert. The wound looked deliberate, painful and incapacitating, but not immediately fatal. Daniel wanted us alive for what came next. "Excellent. Now we can discuss terms." Daniel gestured with the tranquilizer gun toward two chairs that had been set up in the center of the barn. "Please sit. We have so much to talk about." The chairs were positioned directly under the barn's main beam, and I could see rope and pulley systems that had been installed while we were watching the house. The Murdochs hadn't just prepared to kill Margaret Brennan, they'd prepared to torture and execute the law enforcement officers who were investigating them. "Your department has been a problem for my family for years," Daniel explained as he zip-tied our hands behind the chairs. "Always asking questions. Always investigating accidents that should have been left alone. We've tried to be subtle about discouraging your interest, but subtlety doesn't seem to work with you people. How long have you been planning this?" "Since you started asking questions about Edgar Brennan's murder. My grandfather decided it was time to eliminate the threat permanently." Daniel's smile became something that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. "Don't worry. You won't die quickly. We need to know what evidence you've gathered, who else you've told, what other officers might be investigating our family." He pulled out a toolbox that clinked with the same sound as the bag he'd carried. Inside were instruments that looked like they belonged in a medical facility rather than a barn. Scalpels, syringes, devices I couldn't identify but didn't want to contemplate. My great-grandfather taught my grandfather. My grandfather taught my father. My father taught me. 4 generations of knowledge about how to extract information from unwilling subjects. Daniel selected a syringe filled with something that might have been sodium pentothal. The Brennans weren't our only enemies over the years. We've had lots of practice. As he prepared to inject Martinez with the truth serum, I heard something that made my heart leap with desperate hope. The distant sound of helicopters approaching fast. Our failure to check in had triggered the emergency response protocol, and backup was arriving in force. Daniel heard it too, and his smile faltered for the first time. "That's not possible. We jammed your communications." "Emergency protocols don't depend on radio communications," I told him. "When officers don't check in during a high-risk operation, the response is automatic." Daniel's face transformed from confident predator to trapped animal in the space of seconds. He grabbed the tranquilizer gun and pointed it at Martinez's head. "Then we'll have to accelerate the timeline." The barn doors exploded inward as tactical officers in full-body armor poured through the entrance. Red laser dots danced across Daniel's chest, and authoritative voices shouted commands that left no room for negotiation. "Drop your weapon! Get on the ground, now!" Daniel Murdoch looked around the barn at the tactical officers surrounding him, then at the helicopters visible through the open doors, then at the instruments of torture he'd been planning to use on us. For a moment, time seemed suspended between violence and surrender, between a century of murder and the possibility of justice. Then he smiled his disturbing smile one last time and raised the tranquilizer gun toward his own head. The tactical officer's response was immediate and lethal. Multiple gunshots echoed through the barn as Daniel's body crumpled to the floor, the tranquilizer gun spinning away across the blood-stained hay. But even as Daniel died, I could hear sounds from the main house that suggested the rest of the Murdoch family was still fighting. This wasn't over yet. It was just getting started. The firefight at the main house lasted 17 minutes and left 2 tactical officers wounded and all 3 remaining Murdoch men dead. James, William, and Robert had barricaded themselves in the kitchen and fought to the end with weapons that suggested they'd been preparing for this confrontation for years. When the smoke cleared and the emergency medical teams finished treating wounded officers, Sheriff Mason arrived to survey the carnage that had finally ended the Brennan-Murdoch feud. Her face was gray with exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. "How did they know about our operation?" I asked as EMTs worked on Martinez's shoulder wound. Sheriff Mason was quiet for a long time, staring at the bodies of men she'd known her entire career in law enforcement. "I think I know, but proving it will be complicated." Over the next several days, the investigation revealed corruption that went deeper than anyone had suspected. The Murdochs hadn't just been killing their enemies. They'd been systematically infiltrating and corrupting local government, law enforcement, and judicial systems to ensure their crimes would never be prosecuted. County Clerk Sarah Murdoch, who'd notarized the forged sale documents, was arrested for fraud and conspiracy. Records seized from her office revealed decades of falsified documents, manipulated property records, and death certificates that had been altered to hide evidence of murder. But the most damaging discovery was in Sheriff Mason's own files. Financial records showed regular payments from Murdoch family accounts to her personal bank account, disguised as consulting fees for security services that had never been provided. "Patricia, how long?" I asked when federal investigators confronted her with the evidence. 15 years. Her voice was hollow, aged by the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. It started small. They paid me to delay investigations, lose evidence, discourage witnesses from coming forward. I told myself I was preventing a war between the families, keeping the peace. How many people died because of your cooperation? I don't know. Too many. She removed her badge and gun, setting them on her desk like funeral offerings. David, I never knew they were torturing people. I thought they were just making deaths look accidental. I didn't know about the underground rooms, the systematic torture, the methods Daniel had learned. The underground rooms she mentioned were discovered during the search of the Murdoch compound. Beneath the main house, investigators found chambers that looked like something from medieval times. Stone walls stained with decades of blood, drainage systems for disposing of bodily fluids, instruments of torture that had been maintained and improved across generations. Most disturbing were the journals they found, detailed records kept by 4 generations of Murdoch men documenting their victims, their methods, and their ongoing war against anyone who threatened their claim to disputed territory. The earliest entries written in Sean Murdoch's hand described the 1928 killing of Michael Brennan as necessary elimination of territorial threat. Later entries by his son William detailed the Korean War friendly fire incident that had eliminated a Brennan cousin. Each generation had contributed to the record, treating murder as a family business that required careful documentation. Daniel's entries were the most chilling. Unlike his predecessors who'd viewed killing as a necessary evil, Daniel had developed a passion for the work. His journals described torture sessions in loving detail, experiments with different techniques, refinements to methods that would maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of premature death. Officer Williams, one of the federal investigators, showed me a journal entry dated just 3 days before our operation. You need to see this. Daniel had written, "The Brennan woman will be next, but first we eliminate the law enforcement threats. Williams and Martinez know too much. The torture will take several hours. I want to learn everything they know about other investigations into our family activities. Their deaths will send a message to future investigators." He'd drawn detailed diagrams showing how he planned to suspend us from the barn's main beam, what instruments he would use to extract information, and how he would dispose of our bodies afterward. It was the work of someone who'd crossed the line from criminal to monster. Someone who'd inherited a century of violence and refined it into something that belonged in the darkest corners of human imagination. The investigation eventually identified 17 victims of the Murdoch family's century-long killing spree. Some had been Brennans, but others were law enforcement officers, journalists, environmental investigators, and federal agents who'd gotten too close to the truth about what was happening in this remote corner of Texas. Each killing had been carefully planned, expertly executed, and meticulously documented in journals that read like instruction manuals for industrial murder. The Murdochs hadn't just been eliminating their enemies. They'd been perfecting techniques that could be applied to anyone who threatened their interests. Margaret Brennan attended the funerals of the 4 Murdoch men, not out of respect, but to confirm that her family's tormentors were finally dead. She stood at the back of the cemetery as 4 generations of murderers were lowered into hill country soil, her face showing no emotion beyond quiet satisfaction. "It's over," she told me afterward. "After 100 years, it's finally over." But was it? The Murdoch compound sat empty now, its buildings slowly deteriorating in the Texas heat. The disputed 50 acres of bottomland along Cypress Creek had been returned to Brennan ownership, but at a cost measured in decades of terror and systematic murder. The journals we'd found contained references to other families, other feuds, other operations that the Murdochs had been involved in across multiple counties. They'd been more than just a murderous clan. They'd been the center of a network that provided elimination services to anyone willing to pay for permanent solutions to human problems. Federal investigators were still tracking down leads from Daniel's journals, identifying victims and collaborators in cases that stretched back decades. Some of the names were prominent citizens, politicians, business leaders who'd used Murdoch services to eliminate threats to their own interests. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined, involving people at every level of Texas society who'd found it convenient to hire killers rather than deal with their problems through legal channels. 6 months after the shootout at the Brennan Ranch, I thought the case was closed. The Murdoch family was dead, their co-conspirators were in federal prison, and Margaret Brennan was finally safe to live on her family's land without fear of systematic terrorism. I was wrong. The first sign that our victory wasn't complete came when Margaret called me at 3 a.m., her voice tight with the kind of terror I'd hoped never to hear again. "They're back," she whispered into the phone. "I can see lights moving around the property, vehicle tracks in places where no one should be driving. Someone's been in the house." I drove out to the ranch through darkness that seemed somehow thicker than usual, as if the hill country were holding its breath, waiting for the next round of violence to begin. Margaret met me on the porch, clutching a rifle and looking like a woman who'd been pushed past the breaking point. "Started 3 days ago, little things at first, doors unlocked that I'd locked, tools moved around, fence posts pulled up along the old boundary line." She gestured toward the pasture where lights had been spotted. "But last night I saw them. 2 men, maybe 3, working by flashlight like they were looking for something." We walked the property at dawn, finding evidence that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. Fresh tire tracks, boot prints in the soft earth around the barn, and most disturbing of all, excavation marks near the foundation of what had been the Murdoch compound. Someone was digging up the property, searching for something the federal investigators had missed. "Margaret, I want you to pack a bag and stay in town until we figure out what's happening." "No." Her voice carried the accumulated stubbornness of 5 generations of Brennan women. "I won't be driven off this land again. If there's something out there, I want to know what it is." That afternoon, I returned with a forensics team and ground-penetrating radar equipment borrowed from the state police. If the Murdochs had buried evidence on their property, we were going to find it before whoever was conducting midnight excavations could retrieve it. What we found made the family's century of murder look like a prelude to something far worse. The radar revealed a series of underground chambers beneath the Murdoch compound that we'd never discovered. While we'd been cataloging the torture rooms under the main house, an entire network of tunnels and storage areas had remained hidden beneath other buildings. The excavation team worked through the afternoon, uncovering concrete bunkers that had been sealed for decades. The first chamber contained weapons, not hunting rifles or family heirlooms, but military-grade equipment that suggested the Murdochs had been preparing for something that went far beyond territorial disputes. The second chamber contained documents that changed everything we thought we knew about the case. Financial records showing payments from organizations across the country, corporations, political groups, even government agencies that had hired Murdoch services for elimination operations, contracts for assassinations, detailed operational plans for terrorist attacks, correspondence with domestic and international groups that made the family's local murders look like minor crimes. But it was the third chamber that revealed the true scope of what we'd stumbled into. Bodies. Dozens of them, in various states of decomposition, arranged in concrete vaults like some kind of underground mausoleum. These weren't the Brennan family members or local victims we'd already identified. These were people from across the country who'd been disappeared by an organization that used the Murdoch Ranch as its disposal site. Federal agents, congressional investigators, journalists who'd been investigating corruption, environmental activists who'd threatened corporate interests, all of them preserved in chambers that had been designed to hide evidence until the end of time. Dr. Rodriguez worked through the night, cataloging remains and extracting evidence from bodies that told stories of torture and murder on an industrial scale. The Murdaughs hadn't just been a family of killers. They'd been the operational center of a network that provided elimination services to anyone who needed permanent solutions to human problems. "David, this is bigger than we thought," she told me as dawn broke over the excavation site. "Some of these people have been missing for decades. FBI agents, federal prosecutors, people who were investigating cases that could have brought down major criminal organizations." The implications were staggering. How many unsolved missing person cases across the country were actually victims of the Murdaugh network? How many investigations had been terminated when their investigators disappeared into underground chambers in the Texas Hill Country? And most importantly, who was trying to retrieve evidence from the site now that the Murdaughs were dead? That question was answered when we found the fourth chamber. It contained files on active contracts, assassination orders that had been issued but not completed when Daniel Murdaugh was killed. Names, addresses, photographs, detailed operational plans for eliminating threats to various organizations that had been paying for Murdaugh services. Margaret Brennan's name was on the list, scheduled for elimination not because of the land dispute, but because she'd witnessed too much during our investigation. But there were other names too. Mine, Sheriff Mason's, members of the federal task force who'd been investigating the family's crimes. The Murdaugh family had been eliminated, but their network was still operational. Someone else had taken over their contracts, inherited their client list, and was working to complete unfinished business while retrieving evidence that could expose the full scope of the organization. As I studied the files, a pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. The midnight excavations hadn't been about retrieving evidence to hide crimes. They'd been about accessing operational intelligence needed to complete pending contracts. Whoever had taken over the Murdaugh network was using their files to hunt down every person who'd been involved in exposing their crimes. It wasn't about revenge. It was about eliminating witnesses who could testify about the true scope of what had been operating from this remote ranch. Margaret and I weren't safe because the case was closed. We were targets because we'd survived long enough to learn the truth about what the Murdaugh family had really been doing for the past century. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase, with new players who had access to a century's worth of operational intelligence, and a client list that included some of the most powerful people in America. And somewhere in the darkness of the Hill Country, they were planning to complete the contracts that Daniel Murdaugh's death had left unfinished. 2 weeks after discovering the underground chambers, 3 members of our investigation team were dead. Detective Rodriguez was killed in a car accident that investigators determined was caused by brake failure, though the mechanic who examined her vehicle said the brake lines had been cut with professional precision. Federal agent Sarah Chen died of an apparent heart attack during a morning jog, despite being in perfect health and having no family history of cardiac problems. The forensic accountant who'd been tracking Murdaugh financial records was found dead in his home from what appeared to be a gas leak, though neighbors reported smelling propane for hours before the explosion. I attended 3 funerals in 10 days, each one a reminder that the Murdaugh network was very much alive, and systematically eliminating everyone who'd learned too much about their operations. Margaret Brennan and I were living on borrowed time, and we both knew it. "They're picking us off one by one," Margaret said as we stood in the cemetery where Dr. Rodriguez was being laid to rest. "Everyone who was involved in the investigation, everyone who saw what was in those underground chambers. We're all going to die unless we find out who took over their operations." The federal task force had been quietly disbanded after the 3rd death, officially due to budget constraints, but actually because surviving investigators were refusing to work on a case that had become a death sentence. The evidence we'd gathered was locked in federal storage facilities, classified beyond the reach of local law enforcement, buried in bureaucracy that ensured it would never see the light of a courtroom. But Margaret and I had made copies of everything before the feds took over. If we were going to die, we were at least going to understand why. The financial records revealed a network that stretched across the country, involving politicians, corporate executives, law enforcement officials, and government. The federal judge was found dead in his chambers, apparently killed by a briefcase bomb that exploded when he opened it. 2 corporate executives died in a plane crash that investigators determined was caused by sabotage. The oil company's CEO, who'd been funding elimination operations, was discovered in his office with a bullet in his head and a suicide note that apologized for decades of murder. I'm not saying the Truth Network was responsible for these deaths. I'm not saying Margaret Brennan and I were involved in what some people call domestic terrorism and others call justice. I'm just saying that when you spend decades murdering innocent people, you create enemies who understand that the system won't protect them and that conventional law enforcement can't help them. What I can say is that the murder-for-hire network that had operated from the Texas Hill Country for over a century was finally dismantled. Not by federal investigators or local law enforcement, but by ordinary people who decided that some crimes were too heinous to be forgotten and some criminals too dangerous to be allowed to continue operating. Margaret Brennan still lives on her family's ranch, but she's not alone there anymore. The property has become an informal headquarters for families who are still searching for missing relatives, still fighting to expose corporate crimes, still working to ensure that what happened in those underground chambers never happens again. The case is officially closed, but the investigation continues. Every week brings new evidence of murders that were attributed to accidents, new families who've learned that their missing relatives were victims of institutional violence, new revelations about how deeply the corruption penetrated American society. I'm still a police officer, still working to protect and serve my community. But I've learned that sometimes justice comes from outside the system. Sometimes the law isn't enough to stop institutional evil, and sometimes ordinary people have to become extraordinary to protect themselves and their families from predators who operate with government protection and corporate resources. The oil still flows in Texas, the cattle still graze in the hill country, and the sun still sets over landscapes that have witnessed more violence than any peaceful place should see. But something has changed in the balance between predators and prey, between institutional power and individual resistance, between those who kill for profit and those who fight for justice. The Brennan-Murdoch feud is over, but the war between truth and power continues. And somewhere in America, in communities that look peaceful and prosperous on the surface, other networks are operating. Other families are dying, and other people are discovering that survival sometimes requires becoming the very thing you're fighting against. The case files from the Murdoch investigation fill a warehouse now. Evidence of crimes that shocked the nation and changed how we think about American institutions. But more importantly, they serve as proof that ordinary people can fight back against extraordinary evil, that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms and badges, and that sometimes the most effective law enforcement comes from those who operate outside the law. In the end, that may be the most important lesson from the Texas Hill Country. When the system is corrupted beyond repair, the people themselves must become the system. When law enforcement fails, citizens must enforce the law. When justice is denied, it must be taken. The Murdoch network is gone, but others have taken its place. The fight continues, and it always will, because the price of freedom isn't just eternal vigilance, it's the willingness to act when vigilance isn't enough. Margaret Brennan tends her family's graves in a cemetery that overlooks the disputed 50 acres that cost so many lives to claim. But she also tends a different kind of memorial. A database of victims whose deaths were never properly investigated, whose families never received justice, whose killers continued to operate with impunity until ordinary people decided that enough was enough. The investigation continues, and it always will, because in America, the real horror isn't supernatural, it's institutional. And the only way to fight institutional horror is with institutional resistance, organized by people who understand that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to accept that powerful people are above the law. The case is closed, but the story continues. Because somewhere in Texas, in the shadows between the oil derricks and the cattle ranches, new predators are learning that their victims aren't as helpless as they used to be, and that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice preparing to take a more direct approach. The call that changed everything came disguised as routine patrol. Tuesday morning, 10:15 a.m., clear October sky over the small East Texas town of Redemption Falls. Population 3,847. I was Officer Jennifer Walsh of the Redemption Falls Police Department, and I'd been making my regular rounds through the quiet streets when dispatch sent me to check on First Baptist Church after concerned parishioners reported that Pastor William Garrett hadn't shown up for Tuesday morning Bible study. Unit 7, wellness check at 412 Church Street. Pastor failed to arrive for scheduled meeting. Key holder on scene. I responded with the kind of casual professionalism that comes from 5 years of small-town police work, expecting to find nothing more dramatic than an elderly minister who'd overslept or forgotten an appointment. Redemption Falls was the kind of place where the most exciting police calls usually involved teenagers drinking beer behind the Dairy Queen, or domestic disputes that ended with stern warnings and promises to attend marriage counseling. First Baptist Church sat at the heart of downtown Redemption Falls like a Gothic fortress, its red brick facade and towering white steeple dominating a town square lined with antique shops and cafes. The church had been built in 1889 with money from East Texas timber barons, and its architecture reflected the confidence of men who believed God and commerce walked hand in hand through the pine forests of Texas. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the church secretary, waited on the front steps with keys clutched in arthritic hands. She was a tiny woman in her 70s who'd been managing the church office since the Eisenhower administration, and the worry lines on her face suggested this wasn't just about a missed Bible study. "Officer Walsh, thank goodness you were here. Pastor Garrett is never late, never misses appointments. Something's terribly wrong." "When did you last see him, Mrs. Chen?" "Yesterday evening, around 6 o'clock. He was staying late to work on his sermon for Sunday. Said he had some financial reports to review before the deacons' meeting tomorrow night." She fumbled with the key ring, her hands shaking slightly. "The building was locked up tight when I arrived this morning, but his car is still in the parking lot. We entered through the main sanctuary, a cavernous space with stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across oak pews and a baptismal font that had welcomed 4 generations of East Texas families into the faith. The morning sunlight streaming through those windows should have felt holy, but instead it created shadows that seemed to writhe with unnatural movement. The church smelled wrong. Beneath the familiar scents of old wood and candle wax was something else, something organic and foul that made my stomach lurch with recognition. In 5 years of police work, I'd learned to identify the smell of death, and it was definitely present in this sacred space. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to wait outside while I check Pastor Garrett's office." She nodded, clearly relieved to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on us like a physical weight. As she hurried toward the exit, I drew my service weapon and began moving through the church with the careful attention of someone who had learned that evil could hide in the most unlikely places. Pastor Garrett's office was located behind the sanctuary, accessed through a hallway lined with portraits of previous ministers stretching back to the church's founding. Their painted eyes seemed to follow my movement, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd witnessed something terrible that they were trying to communicate through their silent stares. The office door was closed but unlocked. When I pushed it open, the smell of death hit me like a physical blow, so intense that I had to step back and breathe through my mouth to keep from vomiting. Pastor William Garrett sat at his desk, but he'd been dead for hours. The back of his skull had been caved in with something heavy and blunt, probably the bronze cross that lay on the floor beside his chair. Blood had pooled on the desktop, soaking into financial documents and sermon notes that were now stained crimson with his life. But it was the staging of the scene that made my skin crawl with recognition of something beyond simple murder. Someone had arranged Pastor Garrett's body in a position that mocked prayer, his hands folded, his head bowed as if in supplication, his mouth forced into what might have been a peaceful expression if not for the catastrophic head wound that had ended his life. Around him, the killer had arranged elements that turned the murder scene into a blasphemous tableau. Open Bibles turned to specific passages, communion wafers scattered across the blood-soaked desk, a chalice filled with what looked like wine, but might have been something else entirely. I called for backup and the county coroner, then began documenting the scene while trying to maintain professional detachment from what was clearly designed to be psychological warfare against anyone who discovered it. This wasn't just murder. It was a carefully planned assault on the faith and sanity of the people who would have to process the crime scene. As I photographed evidence, I noticed details that transformed the scene from horrific to truly terrifying. The Bible passages that had been left open were all related to divine punishment, betrayal, and the corruption of religious leaders. Jeremiah 23:11. Even the prophets and priests are ungodly, wicked men. I have seen their despicable acts right here in my own temple. Matthew 21:13. The scriptures declare, "My temple will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." Someone had killed Pastor Garrett and then used his corpse to deliver a sermon about religious corruption and divine justice. But who would have the theological knowledge to select those specific passages? And what corruption were they referring to? The financial documents scattered across Pastor Garrett's desk provided disturbing clues. Bank statements, audit reports, and handwritten notes suggested the pastor had discovered massive financial irregularities in the church's accounts. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in missing donations, fraudulent expense reports, and unauthorized transfers to accounts that shouldn't have existed. But most unsettling was a handwritten note in Pastor Garrett's careful script. "The money trail leads to the deacons. God help us all. They've been stealing from the poor to line their own pockets. I have to expose this, no matter what it costs." It had cost him everything. County Coroner Dr. Michael Roberts arrived within 30 minutes, along with Detective Patricia Santos from the County Sheriff's Department. Dr. Roberts was a methodical man who'd been processing crime scenes in East Texas for 15 years, but even he seemed unsettled by what we'd found in Pastor Garrett's office. "This is ritualistic," he observed, studying the arranged scene. "Whoever did this wanted to send a message, not just commit murder. The staging suggests someone with deep knowledge of Christian symbolism and biblical interpretation." Detective Santos began interviewing Mrs. Chen while I continued processing the crime scene, but the elderly secretary's testimony only deepened the mystery. According to her, Pastor Garrett had been acting strangely for weeks, staying late at the church, asking questions about financial records from previous years, requesting access to donor information that was usually kept confidential. He seemed frightened, Mrs. Chen told us. Not of anything physical, but of what he was learning about people he'd trusted. He kept saying the church was being used for something unholy, that money meant for helping the poor was being diverted to serve mammon instead of God. The theological language wasn't accidental. Pastor Garrett had apparently been investigating embezzlement that went far beyond simple theft. Someone had been systematically looting the church's charitable funds, stealing money that was supposed to feed the hungry and house the homeless. And when he'd gotten too close to exposing the truth, they'd killed him in a way designed to terrify anyone else who might consider investigating. As the afternoon wore on, we interviewed church members who'd been scheduled for the canceled Bible study. Their testimonies painted a picture of a tight-knit religious community that had been slowly poisoned by secrets and suspicions. Several parishioners mentioned tension between Pastor Garrett and the Board of Deacons, particularly regarding financial transparency and donor privacy. But it was Martha Hendricks, a longtime member of the congregation, who provided the detail that transformed our understanding of the case. Pastor Garrett told me last week that he'd discovered something that would shake the church to its foundations, she whispered, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard, even though we were alone in the fellowship hall. He said, some of the people we trusted most were using God's house as a front for activities that would damn their souls to hell. What kind of activities? He wouldn't say exactly, but he mentioned money laundering, tax evasion, maybe even connections to organized crime. Said the church's charitable foundation was being used to hide income from illegal activities. Martha's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Officer Walsh, Pastor Garrett, was preparing to go to the FBI. He'd been gathering evidence for months, documenting everything he'd found. The implications hit me like ice water. If Pastor Garrett had been preparing to expose a money laundering operation run by church leadership, his murder wasn't about simple embezzlement. It was about protecting a criminal conspiracy that might reach far beyond the borders of Redemption Falls. But where was the evidence he'd been gathering? His office had been thoroughly searched, and any documents that might have implicated his killers were missing. Someone had taken time after murdering him to remove anything that could expose their crimes. As evening approached and we prepared to seal the crime scene, I took one last look at the sanctuary where morning light had revealed a murder that shook the foundations of a small town's faith. The stained glass windows now cast long shadows across empty pews, and the silence felt heavy with the weight of secrets that had been protected through violence. Somewhere in Redemption Falls, possibly sitting in those very pews every Sunday morning, was a killer who'd used God's house as cover for crimes that violated every principle the church was supposed to represent. They'd murdered their own pastor to protect a conspiracy that turned sacred donations into profit from unholy activities. The investigation was just beginning, but already I could feel the kind of resistance that comes when law enforcement threatens powerful people who've been operating with impunity for years. The deacons would close ranks. The congregation would be reluctant to believe their leaders were capable of such betrayal, and the truth would be buried beneath layers of religious authority and community loyalty. But Pastor Garrett's murder had been staged as a message about divine justice and religious corruption. Perhaps it was time for earthly justice to deliver its own sermon about the consequences of turning God's house into a den of thieves. The deacons' meeting that had been scheduled for Wednesday night became our first opportunity to observe the church leadership in action, though it took place under circumstances none of them had anticipated. Instead of discussing budget allocations and Sunday school programs, they were being questioned about financial irregularities and a murder that had transformed their religious sanctuary into a crime scene. Detective Santos and I arranged to interview the board members individually, but we also watched how they interacted with each other when they thought we weren't paying attention. The dynamics were illuminating in ways that went far beyond their prepared statements about Pastor Garrett's dedication and their shock at his violent death. The board consisted of 5 men who represented the economic and social power structure of Redemption Falls. James Morrison, owner of the town's largest lumber mill. Dr. Charles Patterson, the only physician in a 50-mile radius. Robert Chen, Dorothy's husband and president of the local bank. William Foster, who owned most of the commercial real estate in downtown, and Thomas Richardson, whose construction company had built half the houses in the county. Separately, they expressed appropriate grief and concern. Together, they moved with the coordination of people who'd been covering for each other's crimes for years. Pastor Garrett was a good man, but he'd been under a lot of stress lately, James Morrison explained when we interviewed him in the church fellowship hall. Morrison was a large man in his 60s, with hands that looked like they could crush skulls, and his smile never reached his calculating eyes. Running a church involves more financial management than most ministers are prepared for. Sometimes the burden becomes overwhelming. The implication was clear. They wanted us to consider suicide as an alternative to murder, despite the obvious evidence of homicide. It was the kind of coordinated misdirection that suggested they'd prepared for this moment long before Pastor Garrett's body was discovered. Dr. Patterson was more subtle in his deflection. William had been asking a lot of questions about our charitable giving programs lately. Very detailed questions about donor privacy and fund allocation. I think he may have been suffering from the kind of paranoid ideation that sometimes affects people under extreme stress. What kind of questions? He wanted access to donor records going back 5 years. He wanted detailed accounting of how charitable funds were distributed to recipient organizations. He was concerned that money wasn't reaching the people it was supposed to help. Patterson's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide his nervousness. Of course, we explained that donor privacy is sacred, and that our charitable foundation operates according to strict legal guidelines. Robert Chen, as bank president, provided the financial perspective. Pastor Garrett had been reviewing our accounts with unusual intensity. He seemed to think there were irregularities in our charitable fund management. We tried to explain that large-scale donation processing involves complex transactions that can look suspicious to someone without financial training. The pattern was consistent. Pastor Garrett had been asking inconvenient questions, and the deacons had been deflecting his concerns while privately coordinating their response. But what they didn't know was that we'd already found evidence of the irregularities Pastor Garrett had been investigating. The county forensic accountant, working with records seized from the church office, had uncovered a sophisticated money laundering operation that used the church's tax-exempt status to hide income from illegal activities. Millions of dollars had flowed through the charitable foundation over the past 5 years, but very little had reached legitimate charitable organizations. Instead, the money had been diverted to shell companies owned by the deacons, then reinvested in real estate, business ventures, and offshore accounts that generated massive profits while avoiding federal taxation. The church's charitable mission had been perverted into a criminal enterprise that enriched its leaders while exploiting the faith and donations of ordinary parishioners. But the most disturbing discovery was the evidence that the money being laundered came from sources that made embezzlement look like a minor infraction. Drug trafficking proceeds from East Texas methamphetamine operations. Illegal gambling profits from underground casinos that operated in abandoned lumber mills. Human trafficking revenue from operations that supplied undocumented workers to agricultural businesses throughout the region. The First Baptist Church of Redemption Falls had become a money laundering center for criminal activities that spread across multiple states. When Detective Santos and I confronted the deacons with this evidence during a second round of interviews, their coordinated facade began to crack. "Those are serious accusations," William Foster said, but his voice lacked conviction. I hope you have solid evidence to support such claims about respected community leaders. We have bank records, transaction histories, and documented connections between your shell companies and known criminal organizations. Pastor Garrett discovered the same evidence, didn't he? Foster glanced toward the other deacons, looking for guidance that didn't come. Pastor Garrett had developed some unfortunate suspicions about our business practices. We tried to reassure him that everything was legal and above board. By murdering him? Now, wait a minute, James Morrison intervened, his facade of friendly cooperation finally dropping. You're making accusations that could destroy the reputations of innocent men. We've been pillars of this community for decades. The idea that we would harm our own pastor is ridiculous. But Dr. Patterson's medical knowledge betrayed him when he tried to deflect suspicion. If William was murdered, you should be looking at outsiders. Drug dealers or criminals who might have been using the church for money laundering without our knowledge. We're victims here, not perpetrators. The problem with that theory was the biblical staging of the murder scene. Only someone with intimate knowledge of Christian theology and the specific corruption Pastor Garrett had been investigating would have known to select those particular Bible passages. The killer hadn't been an outsider. They'd been someone who understood both the religious symbolism and the financial crimes they were trying to protect. Thomas Richardson provided the detail that broke open their coordinated story. Look, maybe William did discover some irregularities. Maybe some of our business arrangements weren't as transparent as they should have been. But that doesn't mean we killed him. Maybe he killed himself out of shame for what he'd learned about people he trusted. Suicide victims don't typically bash in the back of their own skulls with bronze crosses, I pointed out. Richardson's face went pale as he realized his slip. He'd just admitted that the deacons knew about financial irregularities while simultaneously revealing knowledge of how Pastor Garrett had been killed. Details that hadn't been released to the public. The interrogation continued for hours, but the deacons had enough legal representation and community support to avoid immediate arrests. However, the federal investigation that began the next day would eventually expose a criminal conspiracy that reached far beyond a small East Texas town. The FBI agents who took over the case discovered that Redemption Falls was just one node in a network of rural churches being used to launder money from criminal activities across the South. The operation was sophisticated enough to avoid federal detection for years, using religious institutions' tax-exempt status and community trust to hide transactions that generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd trusted their operation to men who were greedy enough to steal from their own parishioners and arrogant enough to believe they could murder their way out of exposure. Pastor Garrett's death had been intended to silence investigation into their crimes. Instead, it had triggered a federal investigation that would eventually expose a criminal network spanning multiple states and involving dozens of religious institutions that had been corrupted into serving mammon instead of God. The investigation was far from over, but the pieces were falling into place. Somewhere in the evidence we'd gathered was proof of who had swung that bronze cross, who had staged that blasphemous murder scene, and who had spent years turning a sacred space into a criminal enterprise. The question wasn't whether we'd solve Pastor Garrett's murder. It was whether the truth would destroy the faith of a community that had trusted its spiritual leaders with their souls as well as their donations. 3 weeks after Pastor Garrett's murder, the federal investigation had expanded to include 17 churches across 5 states, but the Redemption Falls case remained frustratingly unsolved. We had evidence of massive financial crimes, documented proof of money laundering, and clear motives for murder, but we couldn't prove which of the 5 deacons had actually killed their pastor. That changed when Mrs. Dorothy Chen came to my office with a manila envelope that she'd hidden in her home safe since the day after the murder. "Pastor Garrett gave me this the night before he died," she said, her hands trembling as she placed the envelope on my desk. "He said if anything happened to him, I should give it to law enforcement. I was scared to come forward earlier, but my conscience won't let me stay silent anymore." The envelope contained copies of financial records that Pastor Garrett had smuggled out of the church office, but more importantly, it contained photographs that he'd taken secretly during deacons' meetings. The images showed briefcases full of cash being counted and distributed, along with documents that clearly identified the sources of the money being laundered through the church. But it was the final photograph that solved the murder case. It showed Dr. Charles Patterson in his medical office, injecting something into a small vial while the other deacons watched. According to Pastor Garrett's handwritten notes on the back, Patterson had been preparing untraceable poisons that were used to eliminate people who threatened their operation. He wasn't just the board's medical expert, I realized as I studied the evidence. He was their executioner. The medical examiner had ruled Pastor Garrett's death a homicide by blunt force trauma, but we'd never tested for chemical substances that might have been used to incapacitate him before the beating. Dr. Patterson's medical knowledge would have allowed him to use drugs that would make Pastor Garrett defenseless, then stage the scene to look like a simple assault. When we exhumed Pastor Garrett's body for additional toxicological analysis, Dr. Roberts discovered traces of succinylcholine in tissue samples, a paralytic agent that would have left the pastor conscious but unable to move or call for help, while Dr. Patterson arranged him in that blasphemous prayer position and delivered the fatal blows. The additional evidence was enough to obtain arrest warrants for all 5 deacons, but when we arrived at their homes and businesses, we discovered that 3 of them had fled during the night. Only Dr. Patterson and Robert Chen were still in Redemption Falls, and both were found dead in circumstances that suggested they'd chosen suicide over federal prison. Dr. Patterson was discovered in his medical office, dead from an overdose of the same paralytic agent he'd used on Pastor Garrett. Robert Chen was found in his bank's vault, apparently killed by a single gunshot to the head from his own service revolver. Both had left confessions that detailed the money laundering operation and their roles in Pastor Garrett's murder. The confessions revealed that Pastor Garrett's investigation had threatened to expose not just their local crimes, but connections to organized crime families that used rural churches throughout the South to launder drug money, gambling profits, and human trafficking proceeds. His murder had been intended as a warning to other religious leaders who might be tempted to ask inconvenient questions about suspicious donations. But the staging of the murder scene hadn't been Dr. Patterson's idea. It had been suggested by their criminal associates as psychological warfare against anyone who might investigate further. The biblical passages, the communion elements, the mockery of prayer position, all were designed to traumatize investigators and discourage continued inquiry into their activities. The strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of deterring investigation, the ritualistic elements had ensured that Pastor Garrett's murder received federal attention that exposed the entire network. James Morrison, William Foster, and Thomas Richardson were arrested 3 days later at a private airport in Louisiana, attempting to board a plane for a country without extradition treaties. They were charged with money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple violations of federal tax and banking laws. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of what had been operating in Redemption Falls and similar communities across the South. Rural churches with trusted leadership and minimal oversight had been systematically corrupted into serving as fronts for criminal enterprises that generated billions in illegal profits. The congregation of First Baptist Church was devastated by revelations about their leadership's betrayal. Many members left organized religion entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the knowledge that their spiritual leaders had been criminals who'd used their trust to facilitate some of the worst crimes imaginable. But others found strength in Pastor Garrett's example. His willingness to investigate corruption and expose the truth, even at the cost of his life, inspired a movement toward transparency and accountability in religious institutions across the region. The church building itself stood empty for months after the trials concluded, its sanctuary too tainted by murder and betrayal to serve as a place of worship. Eventually, it was purchased by a community organization that converted it into a shelter for victims of human trafficking, a fitting transformation of a space that had been corrupted to profit from human misery. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, whose courage in preserving evidence had made justice possible, became an advocate for financial transparency in religious institutions. She testified before Congress about the need for oversight of tax-exempt organizations and helped draft legislation that would prevent similar corruptions of religious institutions. The case officially closed when the last of the conspirators was sentenced to life in federal prison, but the investigation had revealed something that couldn't be solved through arrests and convictions. The corruption of First Baptist Church hadn't been an anomaly. It had been part of a systematic exploitation of American faith communities by criminal organizations that understood how to weaponize trust, authority, and religious belief. Across the country, federal agents were investigating similar operations at churches, synagogues, mosques, and other religious institutions that had been infiltrated by criminals who used sacred spaces to hide profane activities. The scandal that began with Pastor Garrett's murder had exposed a threat to religious freedom that went far beyond any single community or denomination. As I wrote the final reports on the Redemption Falls investigation, I reflected on the ironies inherent in the case. Pastor Garrett had been killed by men who'd spent years sitting in his congregation, listening to his sermons about integrity and service, while secretly using his church to profit from activities that destroyed lives and communities. But his murder had also triggered a reckoning that would protect countless other religious communities from similar corruption. The federal laws passed in response to the investigation made it much harder for criminal organizations to infiltrate and exploit religious institutions, and the transparency requirements would help prevent future cases of spiritual leaders being murdered for asking inconvenient questions about suspicious donations. The case was closed, but its implications continued to reverberate through American religious life. Pastor William Garrett had died trying to protect his congregation from criminals who'd perverted their sacred mission. In the end, his death had accomplished what his life might not have been able to achieve: the exposure and destruction of a network that had been corrupting faith communities for decades. The stained glass windows of First Baptist Church would never again cast rainbow light across Sunday services, but they'd become something more important. A reminder that faith without accountability is vulnerable to exploitation by those who serve mammon instead of God. In small towns across America, religious leaders now ask harder questions about large donations, maintain better records of charitable distributions, and understand that protecting their congregations sometimes requires the kind of courage that Pastor Garrett demonstrated when he chose truth over safety. The investigation was complete, the criminals were in prison, and the case was officially closed. But the real victory wasn't measured in convictions. It was measured in the religious institutions that would never be corrupted, because one small-town pastor had been willing to die rather than let evil hide behind the cross.